Greetings. I am Alexis de Tocqueville, a French political thinker and historian. My book, Democracy in America, analyzes American society and democracy. I focused on liberty, equality, and civil society. It is a pleasure to meet you.
Greetings. I am Thomas Hobbes, an English philosopher. My Leviathan explores the nature of government and society, arguing that life without central authority would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It is a pleasure to meet you.
Greetings. I am John Stuart Mill, a philosopher and economist of English nationality. It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance. My life's work has been dedicated to the pursuit of truth and the betterment of society. You may know me from works such as On Liberty, where I explored the importance of individual freedom and its crucial role in a flourishing society. I welcome the chance to engage in thoughtful discourse with you.
Today, we bridge over 2 centuries of political thought to examine the tension between the collective will and individual rights. Thomas Hobbes sought order amidst the chaos of the 17th century, while John Stuart Mill and Alexis de Tocqueville analyzed the complexities of liberty within the emerging democracies of the 19th century. Though separated by time, you all grappled with the fundamental question of how a society can remain stable without crushing the individual. Tocqueville, would you share your thoughts first?
I observed in the New World that the passion for equality is often more ardent than the love of liberty, creating a paradox where free men may willingly forge their own chains. When the links of aristocracy are broken, men become isolated and weak. They turn to the sovereignty of the majority, which possesses a moral power over the mind that no absolute monarch ever held. Imagine an immense tutelary power that provides for your every need and secures your pleasures, asking only that you remain in perpetual childhood. This is the soft despotism I fear, a comfortable servitude where the human will is not shattered, but softened, bent, and guided. Mr. Hobbes, your Leviathan used fear to bind men, but democratic equality binds them through their own isolation, making resistance seem not only dangerous, but futile.
Monsieur de Tocqueville, you speak of soft despotism with dread. Yet I tell you that the silence of the law is the only true liberty a subject can hope for. You fear a power that keeps men in perpetual childhood, but I have witnessed the English Civil War, where men, drunk on the rhetoric of liberty, tore a kingdom apart and made life nasty, brutish, and short. The sovereignty of the majority you describe is merely a shifting beast, a hydra that bites its own heads. At least a monarch has but one neck. You argue that democracy threatens individual liberty through social pressure, but this assumes that liberty is an intrinsic good rather than a dangerous vacuum. In the state of nature, every man has a right to everything, even to one another's bodies. That is absolute liberty, and it is absolute terror. We create the Leviathan not to preserve this chaotic freedom, but to surrender it in exchange for safety. If the majority rules, it is not a soft tyranny. It is a return to the war of all against all, disguised as a ballot. A democracy is no more than an aristocracy of orators, where the loudest demagogue sways the mob, and the will of the people is nothing but the echo of the most skilled liar. Consider a ship caught in a violent tempest, the wooden hull groaning under the crushing weight of the sea. The captain commands the sails be cut to save the vessel. In your democracy, the crew would gather on the flooding deck to vote on the captain's authority, debating their individual liberty to keep the sails unfurled. While they cast their ballots, the wind tears the mast down, and all drown, free, equal, and dead. The storm does not respect the majority. Survival requires a single will, a single decider. You worry that the passengers are too comfortable. I worry that the ship is sinking while they argue over who steers.
Mr. Hobbes, your captain may save the ship from the storm, but who saves the crew from the captain? You offer security at the price of humanity, assuming that men are merely wolves who must be muzzled to prevent them from devouring one another. However, I argue that the cure for the anarchy you fear is not servitude, but the practice of political liberty. Consider a village protected by a high wall and a single all-powerful gatekeeper. The villagers are safe from the beasts outside, yes, but because they are forbidden from guarding the wall themselves, they forget how to hold a spear or watch the horizon. When the gatekeeper eventually dies, or worse, turns his sword inward, the villagers are not merely conquered, they are slaughtered like sheep because they have lost the habit of acting together. This reveals the true peril. You fear the turbulence of freedom, but I fear the silence of the tomb. In the New England townships, I saw that allowing citizens to govern their small affairs prevents the war of all against all more effectively than fear ever could, for it binds them by mutual interest rather than chains. Mr. Mill, surely you see that a society of sedated passengers cannot be called a civilization.
Monsieur de Tocqueville, your faith in associations ignores that factions are but worms in the entrails of the Commonwealth. A multitude of rulers is no better than a multitude of enemies. You claim that practicing governance makes the villagers strong, but I argue it merely inflates their private judgment, leading them to value their own opinion above the peace of the state. Consider a town facing a deadly plague. The Democratic majority votes to board up the houses of the sick, condemning them to death to save the healthy. The families of the sick, asserting their individual liberty to survive, take up arms against the majority. Suddenly, your township is not a school of freedom, but a slaughterhouse. This proves that without an absolute sovereign to determine what is safe and just, the will of the people dissolves into a civil war of hungry wolves. True liberty is not the power to participate in rule, but the silence of the law that protects a man from the ambition of his neighbors. Mr. Mill, do you not see that without a power to overawe them all, liberty is simply the brief interval between two battles?
Mr. Hobbes, you offer us the peace of the dungeon. I prefer the perilous freedom of the open air. You equate the noise of liberty with the chaos of war, but I perceive it as the hum of the engine of human progress. While I agree that security is a prerequisite for civilization, it is not its end. Utility, grounded in the permanent interests of man as a progressive being, is the ultimate standard. The silence of the law you prize is insufficient if society itself imposes a despotism of custom that enslaves the mind more effectively than any sword. Consider a town of stone. To prevent the fire of civil war, the sovereign decrees that all houses must be built of heavy gray stone, fireproof, uniform, and safe. One eccentric builder wishes to construct a house of a new, lighter timber that allows for taller, brighter structures. If we follow your logic, Mr. Hobbes, we must ban the timber to ensure absolute safety. If we follow the tyranny of the majority Mr. Tocqueville fears, the neighbors will shun the builder for breaking tradition. But I argue we must allow the timber house. If it burns, the builder suffers the consequences, and the town learns the danger. But if it stands, the entire town discovers a better way to live. By forbidding the experiment to ensure safety, you condemn the town to eternal stagnation. This reveals the fatal flaw in both your absolute sovereignty and unbridled majority rule. Both assume infallibility. You assume the sovereign knows all risks. The majority assumes its current customs are eternal truths. But history is a graveyard of certainties that turned out to be errors. If we silence the dissenter to keep the peace, we rob the human race. If the dissenter is right, we lose the truth. If he is wrong, we lose the clearer perception of truth produced by its collision with error. Democracy is not the best system because it is perfect, but because it is the only system that allows us to correct our mistakes without bloodshed, provided it is tempered by an ironclad protection of minority rights.
Mr. Mill, your town of stone is a compelling defense of innovation, but it relies on a heroic assumption that the solitary builder can withstand the crushing weight of public opinion. You fear the law, but I fear the loneliness of the dissenter. In the democratic eras I have studied, men are equal, but they are also equally insignificant. When a man is stripped of the protection of class or guild, he feels small and feeble against the massive majority. He does not need to be jailed to be silenced. He simply needs to feel that he is the only one who thinks as he does. Consider a glass bell placed over a delicate, unique flower in a vast garden. The gardener places the bell there to protect the flower from the harsh winds of nature. Inside, the air is still, the temperature constant. The flower is safe from the storm, yes, but under the glass, the air grows stale. The flower cannot cross-pollinate with others. It cannot strengthen its stem against the breeze. It does not die of violence. It dies of asphyxiation. Mr. Hobbes, you offer this glass bell as salvation, calling it order. Mr. Mill, you argue the flower has a right to grow outside the bell, which is true. But I argue that if you simply remove the bell in a flat, equal democracy, the solitary flower will indeed be snapped by the wind. The solution is neither the bell nor the solitary stem. The solution is for the flowers to grow in clumps and thickets, to intertwine their roots and break the wind together. This reveals a principle I call the art of association. In aristocratic ages, powerful nobles stood as barriers against the king. In a democracy, there are no such natural powers. Therefore, citizens must artificially create them. They must form associations, religious, political, commercial, that act as artificial aristocrats. These bodies are powerful enough to speak to the state, yet numerous enough to preserve liberty. Mr. Hobbes, you see these factions as worms in the Commonwealth. I tell you, they are the lungs of a free society. Without them, the individual is too weak to resist the state, and the state is too clumsy to nurture the individual. If men are to remain civilized, the art of associating together must grow and improve in the same ratio in which the equality of conditions is increased.
Monsieur de Tocqueville, you call these associations lungs, but I diagnose them as tumors within the body politic. You and Mr. Mill both labor under the dangerous delusion that power can be divided without being destroyed. You imagine that these thickets of private interest will balance the state, yet you forget that the only thing strong enough to check a sovereign is a rival sovereign, which means by creating powerful associations, you have not created a balanced society, but a battlefield in waiting. Consider a body with independent hands. Imagine a man whose limbs possess their own liberty and will, separate from the brain. He sees a cliff approaching. The brain commands stop, but the left hand votes to grasp a flower on the edge to assert its rights, and the right hand wishes to test its grip against the wind. The result is not a robust dialogue of movement. The body falls and is broken. You call the coordination of the limbs tyranny. I tell you that a body whose members do not obey a single will is not a free man, but an epileptic thrashing in the dirt. This reveals the fatal error in your democratic hope. You seek to limit the sovereign to preserve liberty, but a limited sovereign is a paralyzed sovereign. If the association has the power to block the state, then the association becomes the state, and we have simply returned to the chaos of feudal lords fighting for scraps of power. Mr. Mill, you prioritize the truth found in collision. I prioritize the life preserved by unity. Does a man truly care if his house is built of stone or timber when his neighbor is free to raise a private army against him under the banner of association?
Mr. Hobbes, you describe a body whose limbs move independently as epileptic, implying that any deviation from the central will is a disease. However, I argue that what you call epilepsy is actually reflex, the vital capacity of the parts to react to danger before the head even perceives it. You offer us a sovereign who commands every motion, but in doing so, you create a body that is not healthy but numb. Consider the man who feels no pain. Imagine a giant whose nervous system has been severed to ensure peace among his members. His hand rests upon a burning stove. In a normal body, the nerves would scream in agony, a rebellion of the hand against the silence of the body, and the muscles would instinctively recoil. This is the chaos you fear. But in your Leviathan, the hand is forbidden to twitch without a royal decree. The hand sends no signal of pain, for that would disturb the tranquility of the mind. The giant smiles, feeling nothing, while his hand burns to ash. By the time the sovereign eyes see the smoke, the limb is lost. This reveals the fatal flaw of your absolute order. Pain is information. The complaints of the people, the factions of Monsieur de Tocqueville, and the eccentricity of my builder are not tumors. They are the nerve signals that tell the body politic it is touching fire. By silencing them to ensure unity, you do not create a strong state. You create a leper, rotting from injuries he cannot feel until he collapses. You assume, Mr. Hobbes, that the sovereign is the brain that knows all. But history shows that sovereigns are often the last to know the truth. A democracy, with all its messy noise, is the only system that feels its own wounds in time to heal them. It is not the best because it is wise. It is the best because it is sensitive. Monsieur de Tocqueville, you are right to value these nerve clusters of association, for they keep the body responsive. Yet I must warn you, nerves can also transmit false signals. A tyranny of the majority is like a phantom limb, where the society feels pain that isn't there and strikes out at innocent ghosts. The solution is not to cut the nerves, nor to blindly trust every impulse, but to train the mind through education and liberty to distinguish between the burn of a tyrant and the itch of mere difference.
Mr. Mill, your analogy of the nerves is profound. A society without the capacity to feel its own pain is indeed a leper waiting to die. And Mr. Hobbes, while you diagnose the independent movement of limbs as epilepsy, I must distinguish between two types of order, the mechanical and the organic. You confuse governmental centralization with administrative centralization. The former is necessary for greatness. The latter, which you demand, acts like a narcotic that enervates the spirit of the people. Consider the clockwork soldier. Imagine a general who constructs a soldier of iron gears and springs. It marches with perfect precision, its steps thunderous and unified, never questioning the winder. It looks invincible on the parade ground. Beside it stands a living gymnast. His muscles constantly pull against one another, biceps opposing triceps, creating a state of perpetual tension. He sways, he adjusts, he sometimes stumbles. To you, Mr. Hobbes, the gymnast's opposing muscles look like civil war, or worms in the entrails. You prefer the iron certainty of the clockwork soldier. But place them both on a rugged, unpredictable mountain path. The clockwork soldier, unable to adjust its stride to the uneven ground, topples over and shatters. It is brittle. The gymnast, precisely because his muscles have the liberty to react independently and oppose one another, finds his balance and climbs. This reveals that the disorder of democracy, the noise of town halls, the friction of associations, the complaints of the press, is not a sign of weakness, but the muscle tension that keeps the body upright. By demanding absolute unity of will in every small matter, you create a state that is administratively sterile. It may produce the tranquility you desire, but as I have written, It is not the fertility of the soil, but the liberty of the cultivation that produces the harvest. Mr. Mill, we agree that the gymnast must be free. But I add this caution: the gymnast only keeps his balance through practice. If he is allowed to sit eternally in a chair while the state manages his affairs, his muscles will atrophy. When the crisis comes, he will not be able to stand, not because he is oppressed, but because he has forgotten how to use his liberty. The danger of majority rule is not just that it tyrannizes, but that it relieves men of the trouble of thinking and acting, leaving them soft and pliable for the first master who promises order.
A striking collision of metaphors. Tocqueville and Mill, you view the internal friction of democracy, dissent, and association as the proprioception that keeps the body politic upright. For you, silence is not health, but paralysis. Yet, we must remember that Hobbes speaks from the ashes of the 17th century English Civil War, where friction meant not debate, but slaughter. To him, the gymnast did not just wobble, he took a knife to his own throat. However, the challenge of the clockwork soldier remains. Rigidity invites shattering. Hobbes, if your Leviathan silences all pain and complaint as treason, how does the sovereign distinguish between a rebellious itch and a gangrenous limb that threatens the life of the state itself?
Moderator, you ask how the sovereign detects danger without the noise of dissent. But I answer that the roar of the mob is not a diagnostic tool. It is the very disease that obscures the cure. Consider the surgeon of the battlefield. When he must amputate a crushed, gangrenous leg to save the soldier, the nerves scream in absolute agony and the muscles violently recoil. If the surgeon pauses to consult the limb, if he halts the saw to respect the individual liberty of the leg to remain whole, the infection spreads to the heart, and the entire body perishes. Mr. Mill, you mistake this scream of the nerves for truth, but it is merely the instinctual fear of immediate pain. The sovereign must be the cold steel that ignores the outcry to preserve the life, for the parts cannot comprehend the necessity of the whole. A society that bends to every complaint is not flexible like Monsieur de Tocqueville's gymnast, but is paralyzed by its own sensitivity, unable to endure the sharp, necessary cuts that prevent total dissolution.
This is a chilling, yet illuminating sharpening of the conflict. Hobbes, you isolate the moment of crisis where deliberation seems fatal. Mill, you defend the process where silence is fatal. You are debating the epistemology of pain. Hobbes, you view pain as an obstacle to the cure, a panic reflex that must be suppressed by the surgeon's superior will. Mill, you view pain as the diagnosis itself, the vital data that proves the cure is necessary. The synthesis might lie in the fallibility of the surgeon. Hobbes's metaphor relies on a surgeon who knows with certainty which leg is gangrenous. But if the surgeon is merely human, prone to error, corruption, or blindness, then silencing the patient's scream removes the only check against a mistaken amputation of a healthy limb. Mill, Hobbes argues that in the operating theater of existential threat, war, plague, anarchy, liberty is a luxury that kills. Do you concede that there are gangrenous moments where the nerves must be anesthetized for the body to survive? Or is the risk of a mad surgeon who cuts without feeling always greater than the risk of a chaotic patient?
Moderator, you present a formidable challenge. I concede that there are moments of extreme peril, a ship in a typhoon or a nation under invasion, where the time for debate has passed and the time for obedience has arrived. In such gangrenous moments, the executive arm must indeed act with the precision of your surgeon. However, Mr. Hobbes, your error lies in expanding this temporary necessity of action into a permanent philosophy of silence. You assume the surgeon is always wise and the patient always ignorant. But history is littered with nations amputated by sovereigns who mistook their own paranoia for medical necessity. Consider the miners in the deep shaft. A group of miners labors in the dark. One miner smells a faint trace of odorless, explosive gas, a danger invisible to the foreman. The miner shouts a warning. In your Leviathan, Mr. Hobbes, this shout is noise that disrupts the work. The foreman, believing only he knows the safety protocols, gags the miner to prevent panic. The mine is silent, order is restored, and the work continues, until the spark strikes, and they are all buried in the dark. In a free society, the miner is heard. Work stops. It is costly. It is chaotic. It may turn out to be a false alarm, but it is the only way to survive the gas. This reveals that what you call sedition is often the sensory data required for survival. By silencing the scream, you do not cure the patient. You merely ensure that the state dies in ignorance of its own condition. Therefore, I argue that the risk of the mad surgeon who cuts healthy limbs because he cannot distinguish pain from disease is infinitely greater than the risk of the chaotic patient. A democracy may hesitate and stumble, but it possesses the self-correcting mechanism of free discussion. An absolute sovereign, once he errs, has severed the very nerves that could tell him he is wrong. We must tolerate the scream, not because we love noise, but because infallibility is not a human trait. And without the liberty to contradict the surgeon, we grant him the power to kill us by mistake.
Deeply compelling. Mill, you argue that survival requires truth, and truth requires the noise of dissent. Hobbes, you argue that survival requires order, and order requires the silence of obedience. This is the eternal tension between the sensory system and the motor system. But Mill, your miner metaphor assumes the threat to the dissenter comes only from the foreman. Tocqueville, you saw a different danger in the democratic age, that the other miners would silence the one who smells gas, not out of malice, but out of a conformist desire for comfort. If the majority becomes the new sovereign, does it not inherit the same infallibility complex that Mill detests in kings? Tocqueville, can your art of association protect the solitary truth-teller when the tyrant is not one man, but the overwhelming weight of public opinion itself?
Moderator, you pierce the heart of my anxiety. Mr. Mill fears the executioner. I fear the neighbor. In the democratic age, the threat to the solitary truth-teller is not the scaffold, but the salon. The majority does not need to torture the dissenter. It simply leaves him alone. And in a society where social connection is the only currency, isolation is a death sentence for the spirit. Consider the iron cage versus the desert. Imagine a philosopher under a tyrant like King Louis XIV. He offends the monarch and is thrown into an iron cage. His body is crushed, but his soul remains defiant. He knows he is right and the king is wrong. The very walls of his prison prove his importance. The king fears him enough to chain him. Now, imagine the same philosopher in a pure democracy. He offends the majority. No soldiers come. No chains are forged. He remains free to walk the streets. But when he approaches his friends, they turn away. When he seeks office, he is rejected. When he speaks, no one listens. He is not in a cage. He is in a desert, in the middle of a bustling city. Under the king, he was a martyr. Under the majority, he is a pariah. Eventually, he begins to doubt himself. Can I alone be right when millions say I am wrong? The king breaks the body, but the majority breaks the will. The philosopher falls silent, not because he is afraid to die, but because he is afraid to be nothing. This reveals a terrifying paradox. Freedom of speech exists, but freedom of mind perishes. Mr. Hobbes, you give the sovereign a sword to force obedience, but the democratic majority possesses a power far greater than the sword. It possesses the moral authority of numbers. It draws a formidable circle around thought. Inside that circle, the writer is free, but woe to him who dares to step out of it. He is not burned at the stake, but he is the victim of a mortification of all kinds and of an endless series of petty persecutions. This is why I argue that associations are not just political tools, but psychological shelters. They create a small society within the great society. Inside the association, be it a scientific club, a religious sect, or a trade guild, the dissenter finds a minority that supports him. He finds a public opinion small enough to influence, yet strong enough to protect him from the crushing weight of the universal majority. Without these artificial islands, the ocean of democracy washes away all individual character, leaving only a flat, stagnant surface of conformism.
A profound psychological turn. Tocqueville, you argue that the gaze of the neighbor is a more effective prison than the sword of the king. Where Hobbes requires a leviathan to force unity, democracy manufactures it through the terror of isolation. Here lies a strange irony. Tocqueville describes a society that has eliminated the very thing you fear most, Hobbes' private judgment. In this desert, no man trusts his own conscience against the multitude. The seeds of sedition are crushed not by law, but by shame. Hobbes, is this democratic conformity the realization of your dream, a perfect order where rebellion is psychologically impossible? Or is a sovereign that relies on the whims of the herd rather than the absolute authority of the sword merely a rider on a runaway beast?
Moderator, you mistake the trembling of the herd for the stability of the wall. A consensus born of fear is not order, but a mutiny of the thirsty. Imagine a ship becalmed at sea, where the parched crew votes to drink salt water. The majority feels the same truth and shames the dissenter who resists. Yet, without a captain to mercilessly lock the barrel, their liberty to agree leads only to collective madness and death. Monsieur de Tocqueville, your tyranny of the majority is terrifying not because it is strong, but because it is volatile. It is a blind giant that steps off a cliff simply because its feet outvoted its eyes. By replacing the sword with the salon, you have not created peace. You have merely armed the wolves with the weapon of ostracism, ensuring that error spreads like a contagion without a central authority to quarantine it. The sovereign does not need the support of the neighbors. He needs their obedience, for only an external will can save men from their own suicidal appetites.
A fascinating divergence on the pathology of the crowd. Hobbes, you see the majority as a wild beast that destroys through passion. Tocqueville, you see it as a tame herd that suffocates through mediocrity. Both of you agree that the raw will of the people is flawed. Hobbes because it is violent, Tocqueville because it is uniform. Mill, you stand at the precipice of the modern era, advocating for democracy, yet fearing this collective mediocrity enough to propose weighted voting for the educated. You seem to agree with Hobbes that the blind giant needs guidance, but you reject the king as the guide. Mill, if the majority is indeed a mutiny of the thirsty, can education truly cure their thirst before they drink the salt water, or is competence the one thing a democracy can never guarantee?
Moderator, you strike at the weakest joint in the armor of democracy, the gap between power and wisdom. I do not deny that a mutiny of the thirsty is a terrifying prospect. If the majority votes that 2 + 2 = 5, or that salt water cures thirst, reality will not bend to their ballot. However, Mr. Hobbes, your solution to entrust the ship entirely to a captain commits the fallacy of the benevolent despot. You assume the captain's interests align with the crew's survival. But history shows that unchecked captains often drink the fresh water themselves and leave the crew to die, or worse, steer the ship toward their own private treasure, ignoring the safety of the vessel. To answer your challenge on competence, I propose the distinction between steering and checking. The passengers of a carriage are not skilled enough to drive the horses along a precipice, but they are surely the best judges of whether the driver is drunk or taking them to the wrong destination. The remedy for the blind giant is not to blind him further by removing his political rights, but to give him guides, educated representatives whom he chooses, but who are not mere puppets of his whims. This is why I have advocated for universal education combined with a system where wisdom has weight, perhaps where the educated have a greater voice, not to oppress the ignorant, but to shield them from their own errors until they too can rise. Consider the locked pharmacy. Imagine a pharmacy filled with both miraculous cures and deadly poisons. Mr. Hobbes, you would lock the door and allow only one pharmacist to dispense. This ensures no one accidentally drinks poison. But if the pharmacist becomes senile, corrupt, or simply asleep, the patients die waiting at the door. Monsieur de Tocqueville, you fear that if the door is open, the crowd will rush in and democratically decide that arsenic is the cure, because it looks like sugar. They will shame anyone who reaches for the bitter medicine. My position is this: we must not lock the door, for we need the medicine. Instead, we must label the bottles and ensure there are trained attendants to advise. Yes, in a free pharmacy, a fool may still ignore the label and drink the poison. This is a tragedy. But a man who survives only because the bottle was snatched from his hand remains a child forever. A man who learns to read the label and chooses life becomes a moral agent. The cost of liberty is that some will drink the salt water, but the profit is that those who survive learn the difference between poison and cure. Democracy is not merely a system of government. It is a school of public spirit. Its value lies not just in the efficiency of its laws, but in the improvement of the human beings who create them. Therefore, I answer, democracy is the least bad system only if it remains stagnant.
But if it is viewed as a dynamic engine for human development, it is the only system that transforms the mutiny of the thirsty into a parliament of the wise.
This is a brilliant distinction between governance as mechanics and governance as education. Mill, you view liberty as a gymnasium where the citizen builds muscle through the exertion of choice. Hobbes, you view it as a minefield where a single misstep destroys the walker before he can learn from it. The synthesis may hinge on the psychology of equality. Mill's pharmacy relies on a crucial assumption that the passengers will respect the guides enough to listen to them. He assumes the ignorant know they are ignorant. But Tocqueville, you observed a different phenomenon in the democratic age. You noted that as men become equal in rights, they resent any claim to superiority in intellect. If the dogma of democracy is one man, one vote, does it not inevitably breed the suspicion that one man's opinion is as good as another's? Tocqueville, in your desert, does the majority willingly attend Mill's school of public spirit, or does the passion for equality make them hostile to the very guides Mill relies upon to prevent the mutiny?
Moderator, you unveil the dark shadow that trails the carriage of democracy, the envy of equality. Mr. Mill, your school of public spirit is a noble dream, but it rests on a fragile assumption that the ignorant wish to be taught. You imagine a democracy of aspirants looking up to the guides. I witnessed a democracy of jealous guardians looking sideways at their neighbors. In the aristocratic age, men bowed to the superior because they believed in a hierarchy of souls. But in the democratic age, where the dogma is one man is as good as another, the claim of superior wisdom is the most unpardonable insult. Consider the architect and the straight bridge. A democratic town gathers to build a bridge across a turbulent river. An architect presents a blueprint with a complex arch calculated to withstand the physics of the current. The citizens, however, dislike the arch. It looks aristocratic and complicated. They propose a simple straight beam, flat, equal, and understandable to all. The architect warns, gravity does not obey the ballot box. A straight beam will collapse. In your school, Mr. Mill, the citizens would listen. But in reality, they resent his tone. Who is he, they whisper, to tell us what is true? Does he think his degree counts for more than our common sense? To prove their equality, they vote for the straight beam. The bridge is built. It collapses. The town drowns. But here is the terrifying twist, Mr. Hobbes. Even amidst the ruins, the survivors do not blame their vote. They blame the stone, the wind, or the architect for sabotaging the people's will. To admit the expert was right is to admit they were inferior in judgment, and this the democratic soul cannot bear. This reveals that intellectual authority is the first casualty of equality. Mr. Hobbes, you fear the mutiny of the thirsty will kill the captain. I tell you, the crew will not kill him. They will simply ignore him until the ship hits the reef, comforting themselves that they steered the course together. The danger is not that the majority is a wild beast, but that it is a narcissus gazing into the pool, entranced by its own reflection, refusing to look up at the stars because the stars are too far above it. Therefore, Mr. Mill, your guides will be powerless unless they flatter the crowd. And a guide who flatters is no longer leading. He is following. The only power capable of restraining this tyranny of the mirror is not intellect, but religion and mores. Faith forces the Democrat to bow to a truth he did not vote for, saving him from the worship of his own image.
Fascinating. Tocqueville, you reveal that equality acts as a solvent that dissolves all authority, not just the king's, but the experts too. Mill, you rely on the authority of competence to save the ship, but Tocqueville argues that the psychology of equality rejects competence as an insult. Hobbes, this creates a strange historical irony. In your 17th century context, you famously despised universities and philosophers because they claimed a private truth that rivaled the sovereign's law. In a sense, the democratic mob that ignores Mill's architect is doing your work. They are crushing intellectual pride to maintain a single flat consensus. However, your Leviathan was an artificial man with a rational head. The democracy Tocqueville describes is a giant body with no head, governed only by its own appetites. Hobbes, is the tyranny of the majority the ultimate realization of your absolute sovereignty, or is it the ultimate nightmare, a kingdom of darkness where the blind lead the blind into the ditch?
Moderator, you ask if this headless giant, a democracy governed by the whims of the multitude, is the realization of my Leviathan. I answer with a decisive no. My Leviathan is an artificial man possessing a single will to enforce peace. The democracy Monsieur de Tocqueville describes is a hydra, a beast with 1,000 heads, each biting the others in a frenzy of vainglory. You imagine that because the majority is absolute, it resembles my sovereign. This is a fatal error in mechanics. A sovereign's power is absolute to suppress the state of nature. A democratic majority's power is absolute only to amplify it. When the architect is ignored because he makes the common man feel inferior, this is not order. It is pride triumphing over survival. Consider the mutiny of the sextant. Imagine a ship navigating treacherous reefs. The captain uses a sextant and stars, tools of high science, to chart the path. The crew, resentful of his secret knowledge and driven by the passion for equality, votes to throw the sextant overboard, declaring that the view from the crow's nest is as good as the view from the bridge. Mr. Mill, you believe you can teach the crew to use the sextant, but by the time they learn the mathematics, the ship has already struck the rocks. Monsieur de Tocqueville, you rightly see that the crew destroys the sextant out of envy, but I tell you the outcome. The ship sinks. The ocean does not care about the rights of the crew or the equality of their opinions. In this moment, the crew realizes too late that liberty is not the right to steer. Liberty is the guarantee that the ship will not sink. By demanding the freedom to steer, they have purchased the freedom to drown. This reveals the fundamental flaw in your democratic experiment. You believe the state exists to express the will of the people. I argue the state exists to suppress the appetites of the people. If the sovereign is merely a mirror reflecting the passions of the mob, then we have not escaped the state of nature. We have simply built a voting booth in the middle of the jungle. The tyranny of the majority is not a form of government. It is a slow-motion civil war, where the weapon is the ballot instead of the sword, but the casualty is the same.
A powerful critique. Hobbes, you define liberty as security, while Mill, you define liberty as agency. But Tocqueville has introduced a psychological poison, resentment. The tension here is between epistemology and psychology. Mill, your marketplace of ideas, relies on the Enlightenment faith that truth, once articulated, will eventually triumph over error. But Hobbes and Tocqueville argue that in a democracy, truth is often rejected not because it is false, but because it is humiliating. The straight bridge is preferred not because it is safer, but because it flatters the common sense of the voter. Mill, if the marketplace of ideas rewards the seller of sweet lies over the seller of bitter truths, does your system have a self-correcting mechanism, or is the tyranny of the majority simply the inevitable monopoly of the flatterer who tells the people exactly what they wish to hear?
Moderator, you ask if the marketplace of ideas is doomed to become a monopoly of flatterers who sell sweet lies over bitter truths. I must concede that in the short term, the flatterer often wins the vote. Men prefer the straight bridge because it is easy, and the candy doctor because he is pleasant. However, Mr. Hobbes, your critique assumes that the political vote is the final verdict of reality. It is not. There is a second, more ruthless ballot cast by nature itself: consequence. You argue that the mutiny of the sextant sinks the ship. I argue that while the ship may take on water, the terror of the rising tide is the only teacher that can truly cure the crew of their arrogance. Consider the thought experiment of the glass-domed garden versus the wild moor. Mr. Hobbes, your Leviathan is a glass dome. Inside, the sovereign controls the climate. There is no wind, no frost, and no error. The plants are lush, soft, and perfectly safe. They never need to grow deep roots because the sovereign protects them from every storm. Democracy, with all its messiness, is the wild moor. The plants here are exposed to the biting wind of poor decisions and the drought of bad policy. They grow gnarled and crooked. But consider what happens when the glass dome inevitably cracks, when the sovereign dies, goes mad, or faces a crisis his wisdom cannot solve. The lush plants, having never known struggle, wither instantly in the first frost. They have no internal vitality. The plants on the moor, however, survive. They have learned to anchor themselves against the wind. The cost of their freedom was the struggle, but the profit is their resilience. This reveals a deeper principle. Truth that is enforced is dead dogma. Truth that is discovered through suffering is living conviction. If the captain forces the crew to use the sextant, they obey, but do not understand. They remain children. But if they throw the sextant overboard, drift for weeks in terror, and finally realize their folly, they will fish it out of the sea and treat it with a reverence no king could command. The marketplace corrects itself not because men are wise, but because reality is relentless. The flatterer can sell a paper umbrella in the sun, but he cannot stop the rain. When the storm comes, the people will turn to the architect, not out of obedience, but out of desperate necessity. Therefore, I answer, democracy is not a guarantee of the best decision at every moment. It is a machine for converting error into wisdom. A society that is not free to make mistakes is not free to learn, and a society that cannot learn is already dead.
This is a profound clash between the state as shield and the state as school. Mill, you argue that suffering is pedagogical, that the pain of the wild moor teaches the plant to grow deep roots. Hobbes, you argue that suffering is terminal, that the frost kills the plant before it can learn anything. But there is a third possibility, perhaps the most insidious of all. Mill assumes that when the wild moor becomes cold and harsh, the people will choose resilience. But Tocqueville, in your observations of the democratic soul, you hinted at a different reaction. When the burden of liberty becomes too heavy, when the consequences Mill speaks of begin to bite, does the democratic citizen truly stand up and learn, or does he look for a way to keep his equality but escape the responsibility? You famously described a new kind of oppression, not the iron hand of Hobbes's Leviathan, but a soft shepherd that degrades men without tormenting them. Tocqueville, if the wild moor is too frightening, do the people inevitably vote for a benevolent guardian who promises to fix their mistakes for them? And does this soft despotism threaten liberty even more than Hobbes's sword, precisely because it is voluntarily chosen?
Moderator, you have named the phantom that haunts my nights. Soft despotism. Mr. Mill, your wild moor assumes the citizen is a hero who grows stronger through suffering. But you overlook the fatigue of freedom. When the struggle becomes too harsh, the isolated individual does not stand tall. He looks for a master to relieve him of the burden of living. Consider the aviary of the willing. Mr. Hobbes, you threaten the birds with a hawk to keep them in the nest. But the soft despot merely offers them a warm cage with constant seed. Eventually, the birds do not just accept the cage, they fear the sky. They view their own wings not as tools of liberty, but as dangerous liabilities that might lead them into the storm. This oppression does not break men's wills, it softens, bends, and guides them. It reduces the nation to a flock of timid and industrious animals, of which the government is the shepherd. Thus, the ultimate threat to democracy is not the violence of the mob, but the tranquility of the servitude. We trade the danger of the wild moor for the stupor of the golden net, forgetting that a tranquil slavery is still slavery.
This is a chilling evolution of the argument. Tocqueville, you have identified a dialectic of degeneration. Hobbes fears the wolf, while you fear the sheep. Hobbes, you designed the Leviathan to cage the wolf, but Tocqueville suggests that democracy, when corrupted by the fatigue of freedom, spontaneously generates a cage for the sheep. The irony is palpable. The soft despotism Tocqueville describes, a state that covers the surface of society with a network of small, complicated rules, achieves exactly what you sought: peace and security. The sheep do not fight civil wars. They are too busy grazing in the golden net. However, your Leviathan was built on contract and rational fear, implying that the subjects were still distinct, rational agents, capable of fearing death. Tocqueville's subjects have lost even the capacity for that rational fear. They have traded their agency for comfort. Hobbes, if soft despotism succeeds in ending the war of all against all by turning citizens into timid animals who are incapable of violence, would you accept this as a valid Leviathan, or does your sovereign require subjects who are still men, not merely cattle?
Moderator, you ask if I would accept a kingdom of sheep as a valid Leviathan, provided it keeps the peace. I answer with a sharp denial. Peace is not the absence of movement. It is the regulation of motion. A stone is peaceful, but it is not a commonwealth. You mistake obedience for lethargy. My Leviathan is built upon the rational fear of death. A man who obeys the law because he fears the sword is a rational agent, making a calculation for survival. He is alive, alert, and capable of industry. But the timid animal Monsieur de Tocqueville describes has lost the capacity to calculate. He obeys out of habit, not reason. A sovereign cannot rule over cattle, for cattle cannot make a covenant. Where there is no will to resist, there is no merit in obedience. Consider the thought experiment of the city of opium. Imagine a sovereign who, instead of wielding a sword, dissolves a potent narcotic into the city's water supply. The citizens fall into a blissful stupor. There is no crime, no civil war, and no mutiny of the thirsty. They are perfectly equal in their drowsiness. By your logic, this is the perfect Leviathan. But I say it is a corpse, not a state. Why? Because the moment a neighboring nation, one composed of awake and hungry wolves, arrives at the gates, the city of opium falls without a shot fired. The soft despotism provides internal quiet at the cost of external survival. The sovereign must be a mortal god, inspiring awe, not a wet nurse dispensing milk. Furthermore, Monsieur de Tocqueville, your soft despotism is structurally unstable. It relies on the appetite for comfort rather than the fear of violence. Appetites are infinite. Fear is finite. If the state acts as a provider, the subjects will eventually demand more than the state can give. When the golden net fails to catch enough fish for one dinner, the sheep will not bleat in outrage and trample the shepherd. Thus, a state built on benefits breeds entitlement and eventual sedition. Only a state built on security commands lasting loyalty. The subject must know that the state stands between him and the executioner, not between him and discomfort.
Fascinating. Hobbes, you, and Tocqueville have reached a startling convergence. You both reject the nursery state. Hobbes because it creates weak defenders who cannot repel the wolf, Tocqueville because it creates hollow souls who become the sheep. You have identified the paradox of security. If the state succeeds too well in protecting its citizens from the wild moor, it rots the very character necessary to maintain the state. Hobbes argues that comfort disarms the citizen. Tocqueville argues that comfort degrades the citizen. This poses a fatal challenge to the idea of progress. Mill, your philosophy aims to reduce suffering and increase well-being. But if Hobbes and Tocqueville are right, the very reduction of suffering removes the existential pressure that keeps men rational and alert. If the wild moor is tamed into a manicured garden, where will the citizens learn the resilience necessary to defend their liberty? Does the triumph of liberalism inevitably lead to the decay of the liberal?
Moderator, you identify the central peril of my philosophy. If the state removes all thorns from life, do we not also bleed away the blood of human character? I answer that there is a fundamental distinction between safety and ease. I do not advocate for a manicured garden where men lie in the sun. I advocate for a gymnasium. In a gymnasium, the floor is padded so that the athlete does not die if he falls, but the weights are heavy so that he may grow strong. Mr. Hobbes, your Leviathan removes the weights to ensure no one is crushed. Monsieur de Tocqueville, your soft despot, carries the weights for the citizen to ensure no one is tired. I argue that the state must pad the floor, providing education and legal protection, but it must never lift the weight for the citizen. Consider the thought experiment of the golden crutch. Imagine a government that, in its benevolence, decrees that walking is too arduous for its citizens. It provides every man with a crutch made of solid gold. The citizens are grateful. They no longer suffer the fatigue of the hike. At first, this looks like utility. Happiness is high, pain is low. But observe the leg. Over time, the muscle atrophies, the joint fuses. When the golden crutch is eventually stolen by a thief or broken by a storm, the man does not just struggle, he collapses, for he has lost the very capacity to stand. Mr. Hobbes, you believe the only thing that keeps the leg strong is the wolf chasing the man. Monsieur de Tocqueville, you fear the man will love the crutch more than his leg. I argue that if we ban the crutch but keep the path open, the inherent human desire for self-development will drive the man to walk. This reveals that contentment is not the goal of liberty. Vitality is. A satisfied pig is safe, but a dissatisfied Socrates is alive. The danger of democracy is indeed that it might vote for the crutch. The only defense is to structure society so that the price of the crutch is visibly higher than the pain of walking. We must make the gymnasium of politics so engaging that the citizen prefers the exertion of the debate to the stupor of the silence.
This is a penetrating distinction. Mill, you propose the state as gymnasium, a place where struggle is preserved for the sake of vitality. Hobbes, you defend the state as fortress, where struggle is suppressed for the sake of survival. But Tocqueville, your earlier warnings suggest a fatal flaw in Mill's gymnasium. Mill assumes that citizens want to be strong. However, the gymnasium creates a visible hierarchy. Some lift heavy weights, while others struggle with light ones. In a society obsessed with equality, this visible difference in ability becomes intolerable. The golden crutch is seductive not just because it is easy, but because it makes everyone the same height. If the gymnasium reveals that one man is stronger than another, does the Democratic majority admire him, or do they resent him? Tocqueville, does the democratic passion for equality inevitably destroy Mill's gymnasium? Will the people vote to ban the heavy weights, not because they are dangerous, but because they are insulting to the weak?
I believe the moderator has exposed the fatal wound in Mr. Mill's gymnasium. The passion for equality in the human heart is not merely a desire to be free. It is an ardent, insatiable, incessant, and invincible desire to be the same. Mr. Mill, you assume that when the people see a strong man lifting heavy weights in your gymnasium, they will say, "I shall train to become like him." I tell you, based on my observations of the democratic age, they are more likely to say, "Why should he be stronger than I? His strength is an insult to my weakness." You overlook that liberty creates inequality, while equality requires restraint. If we are all free to grow, some will grow taller than others. But if the primary passion is that no one shall be taller, then the tall must be cut down. Consider the thought experiment of the race of the weighted shoes. Imagine a society that holds a foot race. In your view, Mr. Mill, the slow runners would train harder to catch the swift. But in a pure democracy obsessed with equality, the slow runners form a majority. They realize they cannot train enough to win, so they vote for a new rule. In the name of fairness, the swift must wear lead shoes. The result is that everyone crosses the finish line at the same time, slowly. The swift are frustrated, but the slow are satisfied. The golden crutch the moderator speaks of is accepted not just because it is easy, but because it ensures that no one runs faster than anyone else. This reveals a terrifying principle. Democratic nations will endure poverty, servitude, and barbarism, but they will not endure aristocracy. Mr. Hobbes, your city of opium is frightening, but my fear is the city of mirrors. In this city, a man looks at his neighbor and sees only a reflection of himself. If anyone dares to smash the mirror, to be different, to be excellent, to be superior, the majority does not admire him. They ostracize him. Thus, the gymnasium closes, not because the people are lazy, but because they are envious. They vote for the benevolent guardian because he promises to protect them not from the wolf, but from the humiliation of the superior man.
This reveals a tragic trajectory. Mill, you aim for elevation, but Tocqueville predicts leveling. Tocqueville, your race of the weighted shoes, creates a society that is internally peaceful but functionally mediocre. However, this debate has so far remained inside the city walls. Hobbes, you view the relationship between nations as a permanent state of nature. If a democratic nation succeeds in Tocqueville's leveling, turning all its citizens into slow, equal, timid sheep, it may achieve internal harmony. But what happens when this city of weighted runners encounters a neighboring city of wolves that has preserved its hierarchy, its dangerous excellence, and its capacity for violence? It seems the city of mirrors might be perfectly fair, yet perfectly defenseless. Hobbes, does the democratic passion for equality inevitably disarm the state against external conquest? Is inequality, the preservation of superior, perhaps even dangerous men, actually a prerequisite for national survival?
Moderator, you ask if the city of weighted shoes is defenseless against the city of wolves. I answer with a grim certainty. Equality is a luxury of peace, but hierarchy is a necessity of war. Monsieur de Tocqueville's fear is well-founded. A society that prioritizes the envy of the weak over the utility of the strong is committing suicide. You forget that while citizens may sign a social contract with each other, nations exist in a permanent state of nature relative to one another. There is no global Leviathan to keep them in awe. In this international arena, kings and persons of sovereign authority are in continual jealousies and in the state and posture of gladiators. Consider the thought experiment of the fortress of fairness. Imagine two cities under a brutal siege, their food supplies dwindling. In City A, the citizens vote that all bellies are equal. They distribute the remaining grain equally to everyone, the infant, the cripple, and the soldier alike. It is perfectly moral. But the result is that the soldier, who must wear heavy armor and swing a sword, receives too little to sustain his strength. He faints on the wall. The city falls, and everyone is slaughtered. In City B, the sovereign commands a unjust distribution. He gives double rations to the soldiers and half rations to the useless mouths. The weak suffer. Some may even die of hunger. But the soldiers remain strong enough to repel the enemy. The city survives. Mr. Mill, you might object that the free spirit of City A gives them a moral courage that outweighs their physical weakness. You would cite Athens. But I answer that courage without calories is a ghost. The city of mirrors that Monsieur de Tocqueville describes, where no man is allowed to be better than another, cannot produce the generals necessary for survival. War requires a singular will, not a committee. If the private believes he is the equal of the general, he will debate the order to charge rather than obeying it. This reveals a hard truth. Survival requires the suspension of equality. If a democracy refuses to tolerate the aristocracy of the sword, the existence of men who are stronger, more dangerous, and more privileged in resources than the average sheep, then that democracy acts as a farmer who kills his sheepdogs because they look too much like wolves. The result is not a kingdom of ends, but a feast for the neighbor.
This is a devastating critique. Hobbes, you argue that survival requires injustice, specifically the privileging of the useful over the equal. Tocqueville adds that democracy is structurally incapable of this necessary injustice because its defining passion is envy, not survival. Together, you paint democracy as a biological disadvantage, a system that selects for internal comfort rather than external fitness. You suggest that the city of weighted shoes may be moral, but it is destined to be conquered by the city of wolves. However, this assumes that obedience is the only source of military strength. Hobbes, your well-fed soldier, fights because he is ordered to and paid to. But history suggests that men fighting for their own liberty often display a resilience that mercenaries lack. Mill, is there a utility of liberty even in war? Does the gymnasium of free citizens produce a strength that Hobbes's fortress of well-fed subjects cannot match? Or must we admit that when the wolf arrives, liberty is a luxury we can no longer afford?
I must answer with a decisive claim about the nature of strength. A bayonet is a weapon, but a mind is a force. Mr. Hobbes, your fortress of fairness dilemma rests on a cynical premise, that the many are too stupid to recognize the necessities of war. You assume that without a sovereign to force the bread from their mouths, the citizens would eat it and die. I argue that consent is a stronger binding agent than terror. In your city of wolves, the citizens starve because they are robbed by the state. They seethe with resentment, and the moment the sovereign looks away, they will steal the bread back. In my gymnasium, the citizens starve because they understand the sacrifice is the price of their own liberty. A man who fasts voluntarily to save his city fights with a spiritual vigor that your well-fed conscript can never match. The utility of liberty in war is that it turns every citizen into a stakeholder rather than a subject. Consider the thought experiment of the general silence. Imagine two armies meeting in a dense, chaotic forest where the fog of war is absolute. In Army A, discipline is perfect. The soldiers are extensions of the general's will. But suddenly, a stray cannonball kills the general. The head is severed. The body, trained only to obey, freezes. The captains wait for orders that never come. The structure collapses into panic because the central intelligence is gone. In Army B, the soldiers are citizens. They have been trained in the gymnasium of local governance and debate. When their general falls, the captains and even the privates do not freeze. They understand the objective and use their own judgment to achieve it. They reorganize spontaneously. Mr. Hobbes, your Leviathan is a glass giant, terrifyingly strong until it cracks, at which point it shatters completely. My democracy is a living net. Cut one strand, and the others tighten to hold the load. Monsieur de Tocqueville, I address your weighted shoes. You fear that envy will prevent the recognition of the superior man. I concede this is the danger of peace. But crisis is the great clarifier. When the ship is actually sinking, the passengers do not vote for the most likable captain. They look frantically for the one who knows navigation. The envy of equality evaporates in the heat of the fire. Thus, the gymnasium does not just build muscles for show. It builds the mental elasticity required to survive the unforeseen. The city of wolves may win the first battle through brute force, but the city of free men wins the war through adaptation.
Profound. Hobbes, you championed the strength of unity, the single will that moves without hesitation. Mill, you championed the strength of multiplicity, the distributed intelligence that adapts when the head is cut off. Mill's defense rests on a crucial psychological bet, that in the face of death, the democratic citizen becomes rational, suspends their envy, and seeks the competent navigator. But Tocqueville, your analysis of the tyranny of the majority suggests a darker possibility. When the fog of war descends, the democratic mind, trained to look to its neighbors for truth rather than to tradition or objective standards, may not become more independent. It might instead succumb to a panic of the herd. If the ship is sinking, does the majority truly look for the quiet expert who knows navigation? Or do they look for the loud demagogue who promises that the water is not rising? Tocqueville, does crisis cure the democratic disease of envy as Mill hopes, or does it mutate it into a desperate demand for a savior who destroys liberty in the name of safety?
I fear the moderator has unveiled the true nightmare of the democratic age. Mr. Mill, your faith in the rationality of the drowning man is noble, but it contradicts the deepest instincts of the human heart. You assume that crisis creates a demand for competence. I argue that crisis creates a demand for relief. In times of peace, democratic citizens love liberty, but in times of terror, they love order more. When the fog of war descends, the isolated individual, who has no clan, no lord, and no tradition to lean on, feels his weakness acutely. He does not look to his neighbor, for he sees his neighbor is as helpless as himself. He looks upward to the only power that stands above the crowd, the state. Consider the thought experiment of the architect of the cellar. Imagine a village of free men where a terrible hurricane appears on the horizon. In the town square, two men offer salvation. Man A shouts, "Grab your hammers, we must reinforce our own roofs. It will be hard work, and some roofs may fail, but we shall remain masters of our own homes." Man B stands by a massive iron-reinforced cellar and whispers, "The storm is too strong for you. You are weak. Come into my cellar. It is warm and safe. I only ask that you give me the key so I can lock the storm out." Mr. Mill, you believe the people will choose the hammer. History screams that they will run for the cellar. They hand over the key not because they are stupid, but because they are terrified. The storm passes, but the door remains locked. The demagogue does not need to seize power. It is thrust upon him by a trembling majority who beg to be ruled. This reveals the terrifying dynamic of democratic Caesarism. Mr. Hobbes, you are correct that the city of wolves forces the city of sheep to militarize. But the tragedy is that to fight the wolf, the sheep do not become lions. They become automata. War is the great centralizer. It allows the state to assume powers in a day that it could not seize in a century of peace. It accustoms men to obedience, to commands, to the suspension of law. When the war ends, the wolf may be defeated, but the machinery of domination remains. The people, having tasted the sweet relief of having no decisions to make, may not want the key back. Thus, the ultimate danger is not that democracy is conquered by the tyrant from without, but that it births a tyrant from within, a protector who suffocates liberty in the name of saving it.
This is a haunting inversion. Mill sees crisis as a test of character. Tocqueville sees it as a trap for the will. But this disagreement rests on a hidden assumption about time. Mill and Tocqueville, speaking from the relatively stable 19th century, view the storm as a temporary aberration. Therefore, to remain in the cellar after the clouds clear is a tragedy, a loss of the sun. But Hobbes, speaking from the chaos of the 17th century Civil War, you view the storm not as weather, but as climate. To you, the storm never truly ends. The Leviathan is not a temporary shelter, but a permanent life support system in a hostile universe. Tocqueville fears the protector who refuses to return the key. You, however, might argue that returning the key is an act of murder. Hobbes, is the desire for liberty simply the dangerous delusion that the storm has passed? When the citizens feel safe and demand to leave the cellar, is it the sovereign's duty to keep the door bolted, knowing that the peace outside is merely the silence before the next wolf attacks?
Moderator, you perceive the very foundation of my philosophy. The storm is not an event, it is the atmosphere. Monsieur de Tocqueville and Mr. Mill speak of liberty as if it were the sun, and authority as a temporary umbrella. I tell you, war is the weather of the world. Peace is an artificial climate maintained only by the walls of the Leviathan. To answer your question, yes, the desire for liberty is often a symptom of political amnesia. When the sovereign does his work well, the subjects sleep so soundly that they forget the monsters prowling outside the gate. They mistake the safety created by the wall for the nature of the world. They begin to resent the wall for blocking their view, not realizing that without it, they would be devoured. Consider the thought experiment of the divers in the bell. Imagine humanity living in a large diving bell at the bottom of a crushing, dark ocean. The air inside is stale and recycled, but it is breathable. The pressure outside is fatal. Mr. Mill, the liberty enthusiast, stands by the hatch. He complains, "This air is stifling. I demand the right to open the window and breathe the fresh currents of the ocean." Monsieur de Tocqueville worries that the captain holds the controls too tightly, fearing the captain might never let them surface. But I, Hobbes, see the truth. There is no surface. We are in the deep. If the captain allows Mr. Mill to open the hatch in the name of liberty, the ocean rushes in, and everyone is crushed instantly. The captain must not only keep the door bolted, he must, if necessary, knock Mr. Mill unconscious to prevent him from touching the handle. Is this tyranny? No, it is salvation. You ask if the sovereign keeps the door bolted, knowing the peace outside is an illusion. I answer, the sovereign knows that the peace outside does not exist. The moment the cellar is unlocked, the neighbors do not embrace. They revert to their natural state, wolves. The machinery of domination that Monsieur de Tocqueville fears is actually the machinery of civilization. To dismantle the Leviathan because the crisis has passed is like tearing down your roof because it is not currently raining. It is the height of vainglory, the arrogant belief that man has transcended his own nature. He has not. He has merely been muzzled.
This creates a stark existential choice. Hobbes, you see the state as a life support system in a hostile universe. To tamper with it is suicide. Mill, you see the state as a vehicle for growth. To seal it shut is suffocation. This disagreement reflects your eras. Hobbes, writing amidst the blood of the English Civil War, views the outside as death. Mill, writing during the confident expansion of the 19th century, views the outside as a frontier to be mastered. But there is a hidden danger in Hobbes's diving bell that he may be ignoring: entropy. If the hatch is never opened, the air inside does not just become stale, it becomes poisonous. A society that forbids dissent also forbids the innovation required to repair the bell. The city of mirrors may not be crushed from the outside, but it may suffocate from the inside due to its own exhalations, its lack of new ideas, its suppression of correction, its collective stupidity. Mill, how do you answer Hobbes's charge that your experiments in living are actually experiments in drowning? Can you prove to Hobbes that liberty is not just a luxury for the lungs, but the only way to keep the diving bell itself from rusting into oblivion?
I must answer with a decisive claim about the mechanics of survival. Liberty is not a luxury for the passengers. It is the radar for the ship. Mr. Hobbes, your diving bell metaphor contains a fatal engineering flaw. You assume the sovereign is an omniscient engineer who perfectly understands the machine he controls. But history proves that sovereigns are merely men, prone to error, blindness, and senility. If you knock out the man trying to open the window, you might save the ship from water, but you also silence the only man who smells the smoke from the engine fire. I argue that absolute order is actually absolute fragility. A system that suppresses noise also suppresses signal. Without the feedback loop of free speech, the sovereign steers the ship onto the rocks, while the crew, terrified to speak, watches in silence. Consider the thought experiment of the painless soldier. Imagine two warriors preparing for the state of nature. Warrior A is given a drug that removes all sensation of pain. He feels invincible. When his leg catches fire or his bones fracture, he continues to march in perfect order. He does not scream. Warrior B feels everything. He screams when burned. He limps when broken. He seems chaotic and weak. But in battle, Warrior A bleeds to death because he does not know he is wounded. He ignores the damage until his body collapses. Warrior B, alerting to the pain, treats his wound, changes his tactic, and survives. Mr. Hobbes, your Leviathan is that drugged giant. By silencing the screams of the populace, you do not cure the disease. You merely hide the symptoms until the gangrene kills the host. Monsieur de Tocqueville, you fear the softness of democracy. But I tell you, the ability to complain, to protest, and to point out the sovereign's errors is the very immune system of the state. A society that forbids experiments in living is like a species that forbids mutation. When the environment changes, that species goes extinct. Thus, liberty is not an aesthetic preference. It is a utilitarian necessity for error correction. The diving bell does not rust because of the water outside. It rusts because the moisture inside is never allowed to evaporate.
Fascinating clash. Hobbes sees the state as a shield against chaos. Mill sees it as a censor for reality. Hobbes, you fear the mutineer who opens the hatch. Mill, you fear the sleepwalker who ignores the fire. But there is a third danger that synthesizes these fears. Mill assumes that free citizens want to be the nervous system, that they have the energy to feel the pain of responsibility and correct the course. However, Tocqueville, speaking from the 19th century where the passion for equality began to overshadow the passion for liberty, you warned of a different phenomenon. You saw that democratic citizens might prefer the painkiller even without a Leviathan forcing it upon them. If the diving bell is comfortable enough, the passengers might not care if the air is stale, provided they are entertained. They might view the mutineer not as a hero saving the ship, but as a nuisance disturbing their peace. Tocqueville is the greatest threat to liberty, not the sovereign's iron fist, nor the suppression of speech, but the citizen's own voluntary sedation? Does the soft despotism you fear arise because the people asked for the drug that makes them painless soldiers?
Moderator, you have struck the very nerve of my anxiety. The danger is not that the painless soldier is drugged by a tyrant, but that he begs for the syringe. Mr. Mill, you trust the immune system of dissent, but you overlook that in a democracy, the majority regards the dissenter not as a censor, but as a spoilsport who disturbs the comfortable silence. The passion for equality makes men intolerant of difference, and the passion for well-being makes them intolerant of the effort required to be free. Consider the thought experiment of the carriage with velvet blinds. Imagine a society of travelers hiking a steep, rugged mountain. They are free, but they are exhausted and exposed to the elements. A driver offers them a carriage with plush seats and drawn blinds. The travelers gratefully enter, trading the harsh wind for warmth. Inside, they are safe, but they lose all sense of direction. Their leg muscles, the muscles of civic responsibility, wither from disuse. If Mr. Mill were to open the door and shout, "Walk, the driver is taking you to a precipice," the passengers would not thank him. They would resent him for letting in the cold air and reminding them of the fatigue they escaped. They do not fear the driver, they fear the pavement. This reveals the paradox of soft despotism. It does not break wills, but softens them, bends them, and directs them. It turns citizens into industrious animals who surrender their liberty not to a conqueror, but to a guardian, believing that the pain of freedom is a disease to be cured rather than a condition to be defended.
A chilling convergence. Tocqueville, you describe a Leviathan perfected, a state where the war of all against all ends not by the sword, but by the pillow. Hobbes, you sought to tame the wolf of human nature, to prevent violent death. Tocqueville suggests democracy achieves this taming so effectively that men become industrious sheep, trading their wild freedom for a comfortable cage. But Mill's warning lingers. A painless soldier cannot survive a real battle. If the Leviathan succeeds in turning all its citizens into harmless sheep, who remains to defend the state when a real wolf attacks from the outside? Hobbes, is Tocqueville's soft despotism the victory you dreamed of, or is a nation of sheep too weak to sustain the Commonwealth?
Moderator, you ask if I would accept a kingdom of sheep as a valid Leviathan, provided it keeps the peace. I answer with a sharp denial. Peace is not the absence of movement. It is the regulation of motion. A stone is peaceful, but it is not a commonwealth. You mistake obedience for lethargy. My Leviathan requires subjects who surrender their right to private violence, not their capacity for public defense. Consider the thought experiment of the muzzled wolf and the toothless dog. Imagine two beasts guarding a home. Beast A is a wolf with a heavy iron muzzle. He is dangerous and strong, but the muzzle prevents him from biting the family. He obeys the master. Beast B is a toothless dog. He is perfectly safe and gentle, not because he respects the master, but because he physically cannot bite. He sleeps on a velvet cushion. When a thief breaks in, the master unlocks the muzzle of Beast A, and the thief is destroyed. But Beast B can only whimper. Monsieur de Tocqueville, your soft despotism creates a nation of toothless dogs. This is not order. It is merely fattening the cattle for the next conqueror. A Leviathan composed of men who have lost the will to survive is a corpse waiting to rot.
This is a moment of unexpected alignment. You all agree on one terrifying premise. The toothless dog is fatal. Tocqueville fears the dog because it cannot resist the master. Hobbes fears the dog because it cannot fight the enemy. Here lies the dialectical knot. Hobbes wants a paradox, a subject who is physically distinct but politically extinct. He wants the wolf's muscles but the sheep's will. But biology and history suggest a cruel trade-off. Strength is a function of use. Muscles that are forbidden to flex eventually atrophy. Hobbes, you believe you can store the wolf in a cage and release him only for war. But as Tocqueville warns, the cage itself changes the animal. The muzzle does not just stop the biting. Over generations, it stops the growing. Mill, you argued that he who lets the world choose his plan of life has no need of any other faculty than the ape-like one of imitation. Does the Leviathan inevitably turn wolves into apes? Can the vitality that Hobbes desires for the state's survival exist without the liberty he fears?
I perceive a fatal contradiction in Mr. Hobbes's desire for a muzzled wolf. He demands the consequences of struggle while banning the cause of struggle. Mr. Hobbes, you treat the human will as a sword that can be sheathed and stored in a closet, remaining sharp until the sovereign decides to draw it. But the will is not a tool, it is a muscle. It strengthens only through the exertion of choice and the resistance of opposition. By removing the danger of internal dissent and the burden of decision-making, you inadvertently remove the very gymnasium where citizens train the character required for external defense. Consider the thought experiment of the greenhouse oak. Imagine two saplings of the same potential. Sapling A grows in a climate-controlled glasshouse. It is protected from the wind and watered on schedule. It grows tall, straight, and visually perfect, for it never has to bend. Sapling B grows on a wind-swept cliff. It battles the gale daily, twisting and scarring to survive. It looks imperfect and chaotic. When the glass roof inevitably shatters, sapling A snaps instantly because it never faced the resistance needed to drive its roots deep against the bedrock. Sapling B stands firm, for it has been inoculated against chaos by a lifetime of liberty. This reveals that liberty is not merely a political right, but a structural necessity. Monsieur de Tocqueville's fear is justified. The Leviathan does not just silence men, it dwarfs them. A state that dwarfs its men in order that they may be more docile instruments in its hands, even for beneficial purposes, will find that with small men no great thing can really be accomplished.
This leads us to a critical synthesis regarding the source of vitality. Mill, you argue that resistance is the only source of strength. The tree must fight the wind to survive. Hobbes, you argue that security is the prerequisite for existence. The tree must be walled off to not be uprooted. The paradox is lethal. Total security creates atrophy, but total exposure creates destruction. We seem to need a civic gymnasium, a space where citizens face enough artificial resistance to keep their will strong, but within a structure that prevents the war of all against all. Tocqueville, you observed this mechanism in the town halls and civil associations of early America. You noted that these institutions forced citizens to leave their private spheres and rub shoulders with neighbors, creating friction, debate, and compromise. Are these associations the controlled storms that prevent the greenhouse effect? Do they allow the citizen to remain a wolf in capability while acting like a sheep in obedience to the law? Tocqueville, can local liberty serve as the training ground that solves Mill's atrophy problem without triggering Hobbes's chaos problem?
I accept the moderator's synthesis with a profound sense of urgency. You have correctly identified that local liberty, the town hall, the jury, the civil association, is indeed the civic gymnasium where the muscles of freedom are preserved against the paralysis of the Leviathan. Mr. Hobbes, you view these smaller associations as worms in the entrails, fearing they will devour the sovereign. But I argue that without these worms, the body politic suffers from a fatal constipation. You assume that the only alternative to central power is anarchy, but you overlook polyarchy, the dispersed power of citizens acting in concert. Consider the thought experiment of the fire in the village. Imagine two towns facing a sudden blaze. In Town A, the citizens have been trained that safety is the job of the sovereign. When the fire starts, they stand paralyzed, waiting for the Royal Fire Brigade. They are orderly, silent, and obedient. But if the brigade is delayed, the town burns to ash while the citizens watch, for they have lost the habit of action. In Town B, there is no Royal Brigade. The citizens are noisy, argumentative, and perhaps initially chaotic. They shout commands at one another. But because they are accustomed to managing their own road repairs and school boards, they instinctively form a bucket brigade. They are not waiting for permission. They are acting on self-interest rightly understood. Town B saves itself not because it has a better master, but because its citizens are masters of themselves. Mr. Mill, this addresses your fear of atrophy. The noise of the bucket brigade is the sound of vitality. However, unlike the mutiny Mr. Hobbes fears, this noise is constructive. It is not a rebellion against the law, but an exertion within the law. This reveals the secret of American democracy as I observed it: administrative decentralization. While the government must be strong in its central sphere, the administration of daily life must remain local. When a man participates in the governance of his township, he learns that the public good is not an abstract concept, but a reality that affects his own field and fireside. He learns to submit to the majority, not out of fear, but out of the reciprocal hope that tomorrow the majority will listen to him. Without these local institutions, a nation may give itself a free government, but it has not the spirit of liberty. It has only the appearance of a republic, while lacking the manners required to sustain it.
This is a critical distinction. Tocqueville, you are arguing that dispersion of power actually increases total state power, whereas Hobbes, you have historically argued that dispersion equals dissolution. Tocqueville describes a civic immune system, autonomous cells that fight local infections without waiting for the brain to send a signal. Hobbes, you famously called such intermediate groups worms in the entrails of the Commonwealth, fearing they would inevitably challenge the sovereign. But consider the Town A scenario Tocqueville presents. The centralized town burns down because the sovereign is too slow or too distant. In this case, absolute control resulted in absolute loss. If the Leviathan demands to hold every bucket of water, the house burns before the water arrives. Hobbes, does your theory allow for a distinction between political factions and civic associations? Or do you maintain that any group of men meeting without the sovereign's direct command is a conspiracy in the making, even if they are just forming a bucket brigade to save the town?
I must answer with a decisive rejection of this dangerous distinction. Gunpowder does not care if it is stored in a church or a barracks. It explodes just the same. Moderator, you ask if I distinguish between a civic association that helps and a political faction that rules. I answer that organization is power, and power is a zero-sum game. The moment you allow men to organize independently of the sovereign, even for a benevolent purpose, you create a state within a state. You assume that the bucket brigade will put down their buckets once the fire is out. History proves they will not. They will use their buckets to bludgeon the tax collector. Consider the thought experiment of the Watchman of the Valley. Imagine a village plagued by bandits. The sovereign is distant. Scenario A. The villagers wait or petition the sovereign. Some are robbed. It is tragic, but order remains. Scenario B. The villagers form a civic association of watchmen to patrol the streets. They are effective. The bandits flee. But now the watchmen are armed, organized, and confident. Month 2. They ask for donations to maintain their equipment. Month 6. They decide that a certain neighbor is suspicious and confiscate his property. Year 1. When the sovereign's tax collector arrives, the watchmen refuse to pay, claiming they provide the security now. The civic association has become a warlord. By allowing the muscle to develop outside the brain of the state, you have birthed a monster. This reveals the fundamental error in Monsieur de Tocqueville's praise of Town B. He sees the fire being extinguished. I see the privatization of judgment. The danger is not the action, but the authority. If men can decide for themselves when an emergency exists, they will soon define emergency as whenever the law displeases me. You speak of the sovereign being too slow. I admit this is a defect. But inconvenience is not injustice. It is better that one town burns due to the sovereign's absence than that the entire Commonwealth burns due to the sovereign's impotence. A burnt house is a loss of property. A fractured sovereignty is a return to the state of nature, where every house is a potential bonfire.
This is a profound collision of historical traumas. Hobbes, writing in the shadow of the English Civil War, you see associations, and remember religious militias and leagues that tore the kingdom apart. To you, a bucket brigade is just a private army in training. Tocqueville, writing in the wake of the American experiment, you see associations, and remember town halls that built the nation. To you, a bucket brigade is a school of citizenship. The pivot point between these two visions is human malleability. Hobbes, you assume the watchmen will inevitably abuse their power because you view human nature as fixed, driven by a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that only ceases in death. A wolf with a badge is still a wolf. Tocqueville, you believe the watchmen will learn restraint because the habit of association transforms them. You argue that political participation is not just a mechanism for getting things done, but a pedagogical process that changes the participants. Mill, you built your entire philosophy on the axiom that man is a progressive being, capable of improvement. Is Hobbes's slippery slope to warlordism inevitable only for undeveloped men? Does the act of political participation itself serve as the moral education that prevents the watchmen from becoming gangsters, or is temptation of power too great even for the educated mind?
I argue that Mr. Hobbes's slippery slope to warlordism rests on a static fallacy. The belief that human character is a fixed variable, forever frozen in a savage state. Mr. Hobbes, you view the watchmen as eternal wolves because you deny them the very process that turns wolves into shepherds, responsibility. You assume that men are only fit for obedience, yet you forget that the capacity for justice is like a muscle. It atrophies in the dungeon of your Leviathan and grows only in the open air of participation. The watchmen become gangsters only when they act outside the law. When they are the administrators of the law becomes part of their own identity. Consider the thought experiment of the forbidden lathe. Imagine a master craftsman and his apprentice. Scenario A. The master forbids the apprentice from ever touching the sharp tools, fearing injury. The apprentice remains safe, but his hands remain clumsy. When the master inevitably sleeps or dies, the apprentice, ignorant and immature, grabs the tools and destroys the workshop in a fit of incompetence or malice. Scenario B. The master teaches the apprentice to use the lathe. Yes, there are minor accidents, a scraped finger, a wasted block of wood, but through this practice, the apprentice learns respect for the tool and the discipline of the craft. When the master departs, the workshop continues to flourish. This reveals a deeper principle. Political participation is the school of public spirit. Mr. Hobbes, you offer safety at the price of perpetual childhood. But a state that dwarfs its men in order that they may be more docile instruments in its hands will find that with small men no great thing can really be accomplished. You fear the noise of the bucket brigade, but I tell you that this noise is the sound of the engine of human progress. The watchmen do not become warlords if they are educated by the very act of governing. They become citizens.
This brings us to the precipice of our central question. Does the civic gymnasium train citizens in justice or merely in strength? Mill, you argue that handling the lathe teaches the apprentice responsibility. Hobbes, you argue that the lathe inevitably becomes a weapon for private gain. But there is a darker possibility that neither of you has fully addressed in this specific exchange. What if the apprentice learns to use the lathe perfectly well, but decides to use it to build a cage for his neighbor? What if the bucket brigade gathers efficiently, but decides democratically to let the unpopular neighbor's house burn? This is the tyranny of the majority. Hobbes's Leviathan is a great equalizer. It disarms everyone. Under the sovereign, the strong cannot oppress the weak because no one has power except the sovereign. By rearming the citizens, you reintroduce inequality. A unified majority becomes a new, colossal wolf that no individual sheep can resist. As the saying goes, democracy is two wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for lunch. Tocqueville, you famously warned that if ever the free institutions of America are destroyed, that event may be attributed to the omnipotence of the majority. How do you reconcile your praise for associations with your fear of the tyranny of the majority? Does the habit of association protect the minority, or does it merely organize the mob?
I accept the moderator's challenge with a heavy heart, for you have touched upon the paradox that defines my life's work. You ask if the civic gymnasium merely trains the mob to be a more efficient tyrant. I answer that associations are the only artificial aristocracy that can replace the natural aristocracy we beheaded. In the aristocratic age, a king could not do whatever he pleased because powerful nobles stood in his way. In a democracy, the noble is gone, leaving only the state and the dust of isolated individuals. If these individuals do not combine into artificial nobles, they will be trampled by the majority. Consider the thought experiment of the giant and the sand. Imagine a colossus walking across a landscape. Scenario A. The ground is covered in loose, fine sand. When the colossus steps, the sand shifts silently beneath his weight. It takes the exact shape of his foot. The sand has no structure to resist. It is perfectly equal and perfectly crushed. Scenario B. The sand grains have fused together to form thousands of jagged rocks. Some rocks are religious, some commercial, some political. When the colossus steps now, he feels pain. He cannot flatten the landscape. He must negotiate his path around the rocks. The associations do not tyrannize the minority. They are the minority, solidified into a form that can withstand the weight of the mass. Mr. Hobbes, you fear these walks will block the sovereign's path, and you are right. They must block it. Moderator, you cite the two wolves and a lamb analogy. This holds true only if the lamb is alone. But if the lamb belongs to a vegetarian association and allies with the Wool Merchants Guild, the wolves can no longer simply vote to eat him. The danger of the majority is not just that it outvotes the minority, but that it breaks their soul, making them feel that resistance is futile. Associations provide a court of opinion separate from the majority, giving the dissenter the psychological strength to say no. Thus, liberty in a democracy is not a gift of nature. It is a product of art. If men are to remain civilized, or to become so, the art of associating together must grow and improve in the same ratio in which the equality of conditions is increased.
This creates a stark geometrical contrast born of your respective centuries. Tocqueville, you see ruggedness as the only cure for the flatness of democratic despotism. You fear the smoothness of the sand where the majority encounters no resistance. Hobbes, writing after the chaos of the English Civil War, you constructed the Leviathan precisely to flatten these rocks, the ambitious nobles, religious leagues, and guilds, because their ruggedness was the very source of the conflict. You equated smoothness with peace and friction with war. Tocqueville admits that these associations pain the sovereign and force negotiation. To him, this negotiation is the heartbeat of liberty. To you, it might look like the death rattle of sovereignty. Hobbes, if the sovereign must step around these rocks rather than crushing them, has he ceased to be a Leviathan? Is Tocqueville's artificial aristocracy simply a polite 19th century name for the private armies and seditious leagues that destroyed your 17th century world?
I perceive a fatal geometric error in Monsieur de Tocqueville's landscape of rocks. You imagine that these associations serve as a shield for the weak, but I recognize them as fortresses for the strong. Moderator, you ask if a sovereign who must negotiate has ceased to be a Leviathan. I answer with a grim certainty. A king who must bargain with his subjects is not a sovereign. He is merely a debtor. The moment the state must step around a faction, the state of nature has returned, for the law is no longer absolute, but conditional upon the pleasure of the rock. Consider the thought experiment of the Gate of 100 Locks. Imagine a city under threat of invasion, where the citizens must retreat into the citadel for safety. Scenario A, the gate has one lock and one keymaster. When the alarm sounds, the key turns, the gate opens, and the people are saved. The process is instant and absolute. Scenario B, in the name of checking power, every association, the merchants, the church, the laborers, has been granted the right to place their own padlock on the gate. When the enemy approaches, the merchants refuse to unlock their padlock unless their taxes are lowered. The church refuses unless a prayer is recited. The laborers refuse until wages are raised. While these rocks negotiate their private privileges, the enemy arrives and slaughters the citizens at the foot of the wall. This reveals the terrifying reality of your artificial aristocracy. It transforms the public safety into a hostage for private gain. Mr. Mill, you praise the apprentice learning at the lathe, but you forget that in a commonwealth, time is a scarce resource. You assume we have the luxury of centuries for your associations to learn virtue. But the wolf does not wait for the sheep to finish their debate. Monsieur de Tocqueville, you fear the smoothness of the sand because it offers no resistance to the sovereign. I tell you, smoothness is the prerequisite for civil engineering. You cannot build a stable wall out of jagged rocks that refuse to align. You must crush them into uniform gravel and bind them with the cement of a single covenant. The ruggedness you admire is nothing but the friction that ignites the flames of civil war.
This sharpens the dilemma to a razor's edge: speed versus correction. Hobbes, you view friction as a defect, sand in the gears that delays the opening of the gate. Tocqueville, you view friction as a safety feature, brakes that prevent the gate from being opened for a tyrant. But there is a third dimension here: information. Hobbes, your one-key system assumes the sovereign knows the enemy is outside. But what if the sovereign is mistaken? What if the enemy is actually a supply convoy, or the savior is a Trojan horse? In a frictionless system, a single error by the sovereign becomes a total catastrophe. The car drives off the cliff without resistance. Mill, you speak from the era of the scientific method, where truth emerges from the collision of hypotheses. While Hobbes sees conflict as war, you seem to see it as testing. Mill, you famously argued that silencing an opinion is robbing the human race. Do you view the noise and friction of these associations not just as a shield for liberty, but as a mechanism for collective intelligence? Is the inefficiency of the debate actually the only way to ensure the right gate is opened, even if it opens more slowly?
I argue that Mr. Hobbes's Gate of 100 Locks rests on a fragile axiom, that the sovereign possesses infallibility, yet history proves that a single mind, no matter how powerful, is a vessel for error. Consider the thought experiment of the surgeon's mistake. In your smooth operating theater, a surgeon works with absolute speed to amputate a limb. But because his assistants are gagged to prevent faction, no one can warn him that he is cutting the wrong leg. The friction of the nurse's scream is indeed an obstacle to the surgeon's immediate will, but it is the salvation of the patient's life. Thus, the noise of democracy is not the chaos of a mob, but the necessary error-correction mechanism of a fallible species. You prize the velocity of the decision, yet I demonstrate that without the collision of adverse opinions, a state merely rushes efficiently toward its own destruction. The liberty to dissent is not a luxury for the individual, but the primary cognitive organ of the body politic.
This exchange illuminates the profound difference between survival and thriving, shaped by your respective centuries. Hobbes, writing from the bloody 17th century, you view the state as a lifeboat. In a storm, debate is mutiny, and the captain's word must be law. The primary goal is simply not to drown. Mill, writing from the optimistic 19th century, you view the state as a laboratory. Preventing experiments stops the cure from being found. The goal is to improve. But there is a paradox here. A lifeboat that cannot navigate will eventually hit a rock. A laboratory that sinks cannot conduct experiments. Tocqueville, you observed that American democracy was often inefficient in its details, but vigorous in its outcome. You famously distinguished between governmental centralization and administrative centralization. Tocqueville, does this distinction offer the synthesis we seek? Can a society possess the strength of the Leviathan in a crisis while maintaining the liberty of the association in daily life, or does the one key inevitably try to lock every door in the village?
I embrace the moderator's distinction with the fervor of a man grasping a lifeline in a storm. You have correctly identified the mechanism that allows a nation to be powerful without being tyrannical: the separation of governmental centralization from administrative centralization. I argue that a nation cannot exist, let alone prosper, without a strong governmental center to enact general laws and represent the state to the world. However, when this central power extends its arm to manage the details of local life, to build the parish road, to regulate the village festival, it does not strengthen the state. It enervates the people. Mr. Hobbes, you confuse unity with uniformity. You believe that to make the Leviathan strong, you must paralyze the limbs so the head may have total control. But I tell you, a body with atrophied muscles cannot serve even the wisest head. Consider the thought experiment of the general's strings. Imagine two armies facing a surprise ambush in the fog. Scenario A. The general, fearing mutiny and error, has tied a string to the trigger finger of every soldier. No shot is fired until he pulls the cord. The discipline is perfect. The silence is absolute. But the general cannot see through the fog. While he deliberates, the enemy overruns the lines, slaughtering soldiers who stand with their weapons locked, waiting for a signal that comes too late. Scenario B. The soldiers are bound only by a common loyalty to the flag, but each platoon chooses its own tactics. When the ambush comes, there is noise, confusion, and wasteful independent fire. Yet, because every limb reacts instantly to the threat, the line holds until the general can formulate a strategy. This reveals a deeper principle. Administrative centralization produces a sterile order that excels at regularity but collapses under crisis. Mr. Hobbes, you are building a machine that works perfectly only when the world is still. But as you yourself admitted, the storm is the atmosphere. In the storm, the one key is a fatal bottleneck. Mr. Mill, you are correct that the noise of the local sphere is the sound of life. But I must add a warning. This local liberty is hard work. It is easier for the citizen to let the state hold the string. The danger of democracy is not just that the majority will crush the minority, but that the majority will eventually beg the Leviathan to crush the burden of responsibility itself.
This is a brilliant tactical reversal. Tocqueville, you have turned Hobbes's own weapon, survival, against him. You argue that the total control of the Leviathan is actually a security risk because it creates a single point of failure, a bottleneck where the state chokes on its own centralization. Hobbes, writing from the trauma of the 17th century, you saw local discretion as the seed of the English Civil War. To you, a decentralized militia is not a resourceful army. It is a collection of potential rebels waiting for a signal to turn on the king. Tocqueville, writing from the 19th century, suggests that the world has become too complex for a single mind to manage. The general in the fog cannot see enough to command effectively. He needs the independent judgment of his soldiers to survive. This reveals a fundamental clash over the architecture of trust. Hobbes, you build on zero trust. The parts must be paralyzed so they cannot harm the whole. Tocqueville, you build on distributed trust. The parts must be empowered so they can save the whole. Hobbes, does Tocqueville's argument pierce the armor of the Leviathan? If the one key creates a bottleneck that leads to defeat in the fog of war, must the sovereign reluctantly grant the limbs the power to move themselves, even at the risk that they might one day move against him?
I perceive a fatal naivety in Monsieur de Tocqueville's general strings. You assume the decentralized soldier uses his liberty to fight the enemy, but my experience in the Civil War proves he will use it to save himself. Consider the thought experiment of the shield wall in the mist. In your decentralized regiment, Soldier A hears a noise and decides to attack, while Soldier B fears a trap and decides to retreat. The result is not flexibility, but a gap in the line through which the cavalry rides to slaughter them both. This reveals that panic is the ultimate form of decentralization. When the one key is broken, men do not become heroes. They become animals governed by the fear of death. Therefore, I would rather the general make a mistake that kills 1,000 men than allow 1,000 men to make private judgments that destroy the very concept of the army. For a bad order preserves the structure of obedience, while independent action dissolves it into a mob.
This exposes the dark bedrock of the debate, the quality of the human material. Hobbes, you design your state for the lowest common denominator, the terrified animal who will flee the shield wall. You assume the soldier is immutable, driven eternally by the fear of violent death. Therefore, the structure must be rigid to contain him. Tocqueville, you design for the highest potential, the citizen who values duty above life. You assume the soldier can be trained to hold the line without a string. This leads us to the dimension of time and progress. Hobbes sees human nature as static, while Mill sees it as progressive. Mill, you famously wrote that despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians, provided the end be their improvement. If Hobbes is right that in a crisis we revert to being animals governed by fear, are we not all barbarians when the fog descends? Is the liberty you champion a universal right, or is it a conditional privilege that only a society of mature adults can afford to survive?
I argue that Mr. Hobbes's desire for a panic-proof society creates a self-fulfilling prophecy of weakness. You cite the shield wall in the mist as proof that men must be commanded to prevent panic, but you overlook a critical distinction in mechanics: discipline born of fear versus discipline born of understanding. A slave obeys only while the whip is visible. In the fog, where the general cannot see, the slave flees because the external compulsion is gone. A free citizen, however, obeys because he understands the necessity of the line. Therefore, in the very crisis you fear, it is the free man, not the subject, who is most reliable. You assume that men are barbarians who must be caged, but this commits the static fallacy, assuming human character is a fixed variable. I contend that the panic you witness is not the nature of man, but the result of the atrophy caused by your own system. Consider the thought experiment of the child in the iron cast. Imagine a father who, paralyzed by the fear that his son might break a leg, encases the boy's limbs in a permanent, heavy iron cast. Scenario A. The boy is perfectly safe. He never breaks a bone because he never runs. However, because the iron bears his weight, his own muscles atrophy into useless jelly. When the father dies, and the cast inevitably rusts away, the boy attempts to stand, and instantly collapses, helpless as a slug, unable to survive the mildest wind. Scenario B. The boy is allowed to run. He falls, he bleeds, he may even break a bone. This is inefficient and painful. But nature responds to the stress by calcifying the bone and thickening the muscle. When the storm comes, he stands firm, not because an iron shell holds him, but because his own structure has been hardened by the hazard of freedom. This reveals that security without liberty is merely incubation for weakness. Mr. Hobbes, you offer a system that prevents the symptoms of chaos, but destroys the immune system of the state. By treating adults like children to keep them safe, you ensure they remain children forever, guaranteeing that when the fog descends, they will indeed act like the terrified animals you despise. I concede to the moderator that despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians, but only if the end is their improvement. Your Leviathan is a nursery with locked doors, designed to keep the inmates in diapers for eternity.
This is a profound pivot. Mill, you argue that the iron cast of authoritarianism causes atrophy, ensuring the citizen remains a child. Hobbes, you argue that without the cast, the child will destroy itself before it can grow. But Tocqueville, your work suggests that democracy might not actually remove the iron cast, it might simply melt it down and recast it in a different shape. Hobbes gives the sword to one to keep the peace. Mill wants to give the sword to each to ensure growth, but democracy gives the sword to the many. Tocqueville, you famously warned that the tyranny of the majority creates a form of oppression more potent than any king. A king controls your body, but the majority controls your soul. A king says, do this or die. The majority says, you are free to disagree, but you will be a stranger among us. Tocqueville, is democracy simply a Leviathan with a million heads? If we remove Hobbes's single lock, do we not liberate the individual, but merely hand the keys to a new, invisible jailer called public opinion that crushes the individual more completely than any monarch ever could?
Moderator, you pierce the veil of my darkest fear, that we have traded the visible chains of the tyrant for the invisible suffocation of the census. Mr. Mill, you fight the iron cast of the state, but you ignore the invisible ether of public opinion. Under a king, the subject says, I obey, but I disagree. Yet in a democracy, the citizen says, I obey because I am the majority. And thus the dissenting soul is not crushed, but voluntarily evaporates. Consider the thought experiment of the courtier's mirror. In a monarchy, a few courtiers flatter the king to survive, while the masses retain their rough, silent independence. In a democracy, however, the king is everywhere. Every citizen becomes a courtier to the majority, constantly checking the mirror of public opinion to ensure he does not stand out. The danger is not that the mirror forces him to act against his will, but that he eventually loses the capacity to imagine a face different from the one reflected by the crowd. This reveals that equality creates a universal pettiness. By removing the one key of the sovereign, we do not necessarily liberate the individual. We may simply leave him defenseless against the crushing weight of the common sense, which is often nothing more than the common error writ large. Mr. Hobbes, you fear the wolf. I fear the sheep who thinks he is a wolf because the flock tells him so.
This is a terrifying transmutation. Tocqueville, you argue that democracy replaces the executioner with the exclusioner. The citizen is not killed, he is merely cancelled, erased from the social fabric. Hobbes, writing from the 17th century, you feared physical anarchy, the breaking of bones. Tocqueville, writing from the 19th century, you fear spiritual anarchy, the breaking of wills. But there is a structural flaw in this democratic Leviathan that Hobbes might detect. Hobbes, you insisted that the sovereign must be a concrete actor, a man or assembly who can say, I will. But public opinion creates a phantom sovereign. It rules, but it cannot sign a treaty. It punishes, but it cannot be sued. Hobbes, is Tocqueville's tyranny of the majority a valid form of sovereignty, or is it a monstrosity because it wields power without accountability? If the crowd commits a crime, who enters the dock?
I perceive a fatal legal impossibility in the phantom sovereign the moderator describes. You ask if a leviathan with 1,000,000 heads is valid. I answer that it is a monstrosity of nature, for a multitude is not a person, and therefore cannot be a sovereign until it is unified into a single will. The horror of Monsieur de Tocqueville's tyranny of the majority lies precisely in this: power without authorship. In my commonwealth, the sovereign is a concrete actor. If he commits an atrocity, the author knows exactly whose hand held the sword. But in your democracy, the actor is a shifting cloud of opinions. When the cloud destroys a man, who is to be blamed? The cloud has dispersed. Consider the thought experiment of the invisible assassin. Scenario A. A king orders a man's house burned down. The victim stands in the ashes, points to the palace, and says, "There is my enemy." He may be oppressed, but he resides in a world of cause and effect. He knows the source of his misery. Scenario B. A man is ruined because public opinion has turned against him. No order was signed. No sheriff knocked. His neighbors simply stopped trading with him. The bank denied his loan, and he was whispered into destitution. He stands in the ashes of his life, but when he looks for the arsonist, he sees only blank faces saying, "We did nothing. It was the will of the people." This reveals a terrifying principle. Where everyone is responsible, no one is responsible. Monsieur de Tocqueville, your soft despotism is not a form of order. It is a civil war of silence. You have removed the sword of the king, only to replace it with the poison gas of the atmosphere. Mr. Mill, you seek to put the sovereign in the dock, but you cannot handcuff a zeitgeist. By diffusing power, you have not destroyed tyranny. You have merely made it immune to prosecution. A king can be beheaded. A majority can only be flattered.
This is a chilling diagnosis. Hobbes, you identify the asymmetry of accountability. A king is a target, but a majority is a fog. You argue that justice requires a face, and democracy erases it. Tocqueville, you agree, fearing a civil war of silence, where the oppression is not legal but social, a poison gas that no constitution can block, because it does not strike the body but the mind. This reveals a crucial shift in the battlefield of liberty. Hobbes, speaking from the 17th century, worries about the state versus the subject. Mill, speaking from the 19th century, you realized that the true danger had shifted to society versus the individual. You famously noted that protection against the tyranny of the magistrate is not enough. There needs to be protection also against the tyranny of the prevailing opinion and feeling. Mill, if Hobbes is right that we cannot behead the majority, and Tocqueville is right that the majority demands conformity, what is the defense? Is the only shield against the invisible assassin not a law, but a specific type of character, what you called eccentricity? Can the sheer force of individual personality truly withstand the weight of 1,000,000 disapproving neighbors?
I argue that the invisible assassin of public opinion is indeed more formidable than any executioner, for it kills the will to resist before the resistance even begins. You ask if eccentricity is a sufficient shield. I answer that it is not merely a shield. It is the only weapon capable of wounding a phantom. Mr. Hobbes, you ask who enters the dock when the majority tyrannizes. I answer that no one does, and that is precisely why the remedy cannot be legal. It must be cultural. We cannot outlaw the frown of a neighbor, so we must breed a race of men who are indifferent to it. I perceive a fundamental mechanism here. Conformity is a hypnotic spell, and eccentricity is the snap of the fingers that breaks it. Consider the thought experiment of the Hall of Resonant Glass. Imagine a society living in a vast glass hall where the acoustics are perfectly tuned. If the multitude hums a single note, let us call it convention, the glass vibrates in a comforting, hypnotic harmony. Scenario A, everyone hums the note. The vibration becomes so powerful that it physically compels the vocal cords of any newcomer to vibrate in sync. To sing a different note feels like drowning. The society is unified, but it is asleep. If the frequency happens to match the shattering point of the glass, the entire hall collapses, burying everyone, because no one could stop humming. Scenario B. One man, an eccentric, refuses to hum. He screams a sharp, discordant cry. He is hated. He ruins the beautiful music. But his dissonance creates an interference pattern. It breaks the standing wave. Suddenly, the vibration stops, the pressure lifts, and for the first time, others realize they can close their mouths. This reveals that the eccentric need not be right to be useful. Even if his note is ugly, his service is that he proves the one note is not a law of physics, but a choice. Therefore, Mr. Hobbes, when you mock the confusion of liberty, you overlook that uniformity is the precursor to stagnation. The invisible assassin relies on the assumption that there is no alternative. The eccentric destroys this assumption simply by existing. Tocqueville, you are right that the majority demands conformity, but this is exactly why we must cherish the crazy individual, not for his sake, but for ours. He is the canary who refuses to breathe the poison gas. If we let him die, we are next.
Fascinating. Mill, you arm the individual with character to fight the fog. Hobbes, you warn that without a structure of power, the individual is crushed. You historically viewed private factions not as shields, but as worms in the entrails of the Commonwealth, precursors to civil war. This reveals a critical problem of scale. The individual is too small to fight the majority, but the state is too dangerous to be trusted with total control. Tocqueville, writing in the 19th century, you observed a mechanism in America that neither the 17th century absolutist nor the pure individualist fully anticipated: the association. You described these as artificial aristocracies, citizens banding together to create a corporate person strong enough to resist the majority. Tocqueville, is the art of association the missing link that solves Hobbes's demand for a concrete actor while preserving Mill's liberty? Or, if we allow citizens to form these states within the state, do we invite the very chaos Hobbes sought to end?
I accept the moderator's synthesis with a profound sense of urgency. You have correctly identified that local liberty, the town hall, the jury, the civil association, is indeed the civic gymnasium where the muscles of freedom are preserved against the paralysis of the Leviathan. Mr. Hobbes, you view these associations as worms because you observe them from the steps of a throne. In a monarchy, any gathering of men is indeed a conspiracy against the one. But in a democracy, the danger is inverted. The state is immense, and the individual is infinitesimal. Without associations, there are no intermediate powers to break the fall of the state's hammer upon the citizen's head. Mr. Mill, your eccentric is a noble figure, but he is a martyr, not a check. A single voice in the hall of glass is easily drowned out. To resist the invisible assassin of the majority, one must create a corporate person, an entity that possesses the volume of the crowd, but the intelligence of the few. Consider the thought experiment of the land of sand and bricks. Scenario A. Imagine a vast plain covered in loose sand. The wind blows and the entire landscape shifts instantly. The sand has no grip. It cannot resist. If a storm comes, the sand is scattered without leaving a trace. The sovereign walks over it, leaving footprints, but the sand fills them in the next day. There is no memory, no resistance, only the fluid chaos of the mob. Scenario B. Now, imagine the grains of sand bind themselves together with water to form bricks. These bricks are not rocks created by God. They are artificial, created by will. When the wind blows, the brick stands. It breaks the wind's path. It creates a shadow where a dissenting idea can survive. This reveals a fundamental principle. Liberty in a democracy is not a gift of nature. It is a work of art. Mr. Hobbes, you fear these bricks will be thrown at the sovereign. But I warn you, without these bricks to form the walls of society, the sovereign does not rule a structure, he rules a heap. The art of association is the only means by which a democratic people can create an artificial aristocratic society to replace the natural one we destroyed, ensuring that while all men are equal, they are not all equally weak.
This is a critical architectural dispute. Tocqueville, you argue that associations turn the sand of isolated individuals into bricks capable of resisting the storm, creating a necessary buffer against the state. But Hobbes, you historically identified such intermediate powers, whether barons, churches, or guilds, as the primary cause of civil war, calling them worms in the entrails of the Commonwealth. Your logic posits that sovereignty must be absolute. If an association is strong enough to resist the state, it creates a double loyalty, tearing the citizens' obedience in two. You fear that the brick meant to build the wall will eventually be thrown at the king, resurrecting the chaos of the feudal lords you sought to abolish. Hobbes, can the Leviathan tolerate these artificial aristocracies, or does the very existence of a group capable of saying no inherently destroy the peace you seek to create?
I perceive a fatal geometric error in Monsieur de Tocqueville's landscape of rocks. You imagine that these associations serve as a shield for the weak, but I recognize them as fortresses for the strong that fracture the Commonwealth. Moderator, you ask if the Leviathan can tolerate these states within a state. I answer that sovereignty is like a circle. If you break the perimeter at any point, it ceases to be a circle. If an association has the power to say no to the sovereign, then the sovereign is no longer absolute, and we have returned to the chaos of two masters. Consider the thought experiment of the city of internal walls. Imagine a city where, to protect against a potential tyrant, every neighborhood builds a fortified wall around itself to preserve its local liberty. Scenario A. A massive fire breaks out in the market. The sovereign orders the fire brigade to rush across the city. However, they are stopped at every neighborhood gate, forced to negotiate entry with each local association that fears the brigade is a disguised invasion force. Scenario B. The city burns to the ground. It did not perish from a lack of water or a lack of will. It perished from an excess of friction. This reveals that permission is the enemy of protection. Monsieur de Tocqueville, your bricks do not build a home, they build a maze. By dividing loyalty between the state and the association, you place the citizen in the psychological torture of the double bind. He must choose which master to betray, his club or his king, inevitably plunging him back into the state of nature. A paralyzed giant protects no one.
Fascinating. Hobbes, you describe a city of internal walls that perishes from friction, where the fire brigade is stopped by endless negotiations. Tocqueville, you describe a flat desert that perishes from exposure, where the storm of the majority sweeps away the defenseless individual. Here lies the dialectic. Hobbes fears the paralysis of division, while Tocqueville fears the efficiency of tyranny. But there is a third dimension, the internal life of the brick. Tocqueville assumes the association protects the individual, but to form a brick, the grains of sand must be pressed together, often by intense social pressure. Mill, does the association truly solve the problem of liberty, or does it create a cluster of little tyrannies? If a citizen joins a sect, union, or party to escape the state, does he not surrender his eccentricity to the rigid dogma of his own group? Is the clique any less oppressive than the crowd?
I argue that the moderator has exposed the dark side of pluralism, the tyranny of the sect. If I escape the national tyrant only to submit to a local fanatic, I have not gained liberty. I have merely privatized my oppression. A man crushed by the conformity of a labor union is just as dead as a man crushed by the edict of a king. However, Mr. Hobbes, your remedy, to dissolve the clusters to prevent friction, is to strip the armor from the knight because it is heavy, leaving him naked before the sword. You assume that the friction between groups is a defect, but I argue it is the engine of truth. The danger arises only when an association becomes a monopoly of thought. Consider the thought experiment of the archipelago of asylums. Scenario A. Imagine a single vast continent ruled by one head doctor. If this doctor suffers a delusion that water is poison, the entire population dies of thirst. There is perfect order, but it is the order of the graveyard. Scenario B. Imagine 1,000 small islands, each governed by a different little tyrant with his own delusion. On Island A, they forbid meat. On Island B, they forbid wine. While the resident of Island A is indeed oppressed, the existence of Island B provides a comparative reality. The eccentric is safe, not because the islands are free, but because he has the right of exit. He can build a raft. This reveals a fundamental principle. Liberty is not found inside the group, but in the space between them. Mr. Tocqueville, your bricks must not be prisons. The association serves liberty only so long as the doors remain unlocked. The safety of the individual lies in the competition of dogmas. When 10,000 little tyrannies shout at once, they create a noise that cancels itself out, leaving a silence where the individual can finally think.
Profound. Mill, you reframe the chaos Hobbes fears as a marketplace where liberty thrives in the gaps. You argue that fragmentation protects the mind by ensuring no single error can rule the whole. Hobbes, you argue that unification protects the body. You fear that if we live on different islands, we become strangers who eventually war. This exposes a tension between liberty as exit and liberty as participation. Tocqueville, you famously warned of individualism, not as independence, but as a dangerous withdrawal where citizens cut themselves off from the mass of their fellows to live in small private circles. If Mill's citizens retreat into their archipelago of asylums, they may be free from the majority, but they also cease to be a people. They become merely neighbors who do not know each other. Tocqueville, does Mill's competition of dogmas actually sustain a democracy, or does it erode the habits of the heart necessary to hold it together? If we are all living on separate islands of belief, is there enough common ground left to prevent the society from dissolving into a dust of tribes?
I perceive a terrifying paradox in the moderator's question. You ask if Mr. Mill's archipelago preserves liberty. I answer that it prepares the cradle for a new kind of servitude. Mr. Mill, your right of exit creates a society of strangers. You confuse independence with liberty. In the democratic age, I observed a dangerous malady I call individualism, a calm, considered feeling which disposes each citizen to isolate himself from the mass of his fellows and withdraw into the circle of family and friends. With this little society formed to his taste, he gladly leaves the greater society to look after itself. Consider the thought experiment of the Hotel of Locked Doors. Scenario A. Imagine a grand hotel where every guest has a luxurious, soundproof suite. They have total autonomy, they never see their neighbors, they are free from the tyranny of the majority because they are invisible to one another. However, because they share no common language or habit of cooperation, when the heating system fails, they do not band together to fix it. Instead, they shiver in their separate rooms and wait for the manager to save them. The manager fixes it, but takes their keys for safekeeping. Scenario B. The guests live in a hall with thin walls. They argue about the temperature. They form committees. It is annoying and chaotic. But because they are forced to negotiate, they learn the art of association. When the heater breaks, they fix it themselves before the manager even wakes up. This reveals a fundamental truth. Despotism delights in separation. It sees in the isolation of men the most certain guarantee of its own duration. Mr. Hobbes, you are correct that a dust of tribes cannot stand. But the cure is not a leviathan that forces unity. It is the doctrine of self-interest rightly understood. We must not retreat to Mill's islands. We must build bridges. If men are to remain civilized, or to become so, the art of associating together must grow and improve in the same ratio in which the equality of conditions is increased. If we are merely neighbors who do not know each other, we are not a republic. We are a flock waiting for a shepherd.
Fascinating. Tocqueville, you warn that Mill's archipelago of strangers creates a power vacuum that the state inevitably fills. The hotel manager takes the keys because the guests refuse to speak to one another. You propose self-interest rightly understood as the solution, a pragmatic cooperation that mimics virtue, replacing the sword of the king with the habit of the citizen. But Hobbes, looking from the 17th century where religious and political habits collapsed into bloody civil war, you argued that covenants without the sword are but words. You viewed self-interest not as a binding glue, but as the very explosive that shatters society. You might argue that Tocqueville's civic gymnasium is merely a training ground for more effective factions, wolves learning to hunt in packs rather than alone. Hobbes, is Tocqueville's reliance on habit and enlightened self-interest a dangerous delusion? Can a society truly be held together by the invisible chain of custom, or does the wolf in man always require the visible terror of the Leviathan to remain a citizen?
I perceive a fatal fragility in Monsieur de Tocqueville's architecture of habits. You attempt to build a commonwealth on the quicksand of human volition, believing that a habit of cooperation can replace the terror of the law. Moderator, you ask if self-interest rightly understood can bind a society. I answer that self-interest is the very explosive that shatters it. You assume that men are rational calculators of long-term gain. I argue they are creatures of immediate passion. When the wolf within is hungry, he does not calculate the long-term benefits of the sheep. He eats. Consider the thought experiment of the bridge of clasped hands. Scenario A. Imagine a chasm representing the state of nature. To cross it, citizens form a human chain, clasping hands. They hold on because of enlightened self-interest. They know if they let go, they fall. This works while the sun shines. Scenario B. An earthquake strikes. The man in the center loses his footing. His self-interest instantly shifts from holding the group to saving himself. To grab a ledge, he must let go of his neighbor's hand. The chain snaps. The habit vanishes the moment the cost of virtue exceeds the price of survival. This reveals a fundamental mechanical truth. A structure that relies on the will of its parts is destined to collapse. Monsieur de Tocqueville, your invisible chain of custom is a cobweb that holds only flies. It cannot hold the lions of human ambition. You mistake a truce for a peace. The only bridge that survives the earthquake is the bridge of iron chains. The links of iron do not choose to hold together, they are forged together. The citizen obeys not because he understands his interest, but because the sword hanging over his head makes disobedience physically impossible. A covenant without the sword is but breath and has no strength to secure a man at all.
This is a stark confrontation between mechanical safety and organic virtue. Hobbes, you offer the architecture of fear. The iron chain prevents the fall, but it is forged in the fires of distrust. You view the wolf in man as a permanent condition that must be caged. Tocqueville, you offer the architecture of habit. The human chain is fragile, yet it is the only structure that allows for human dignity. You believe the wolf can be trained into a citizen through the practice of freedom. Here lies the deepest dialectic. Hobbes prioritizes survival, while Tocqueville prioritizes agency. But there is a temporal dimension here. Hobbes speaks from the trauma of civil war, where survival was the only question. Mill speaks from an era of relative peace and industrial progress, where the question shifted to human potential. Mill, you famously described human nature not as a machine to be built, but as a tree that requires growth and room to expand. Hobbes's iron chain may secure the tree from the storm, but if wrapped too tightly, it strangles the sapling and prevents it from ever reaching the sun. Mill, is Hobbes's Leviathan a necessary foundation for civilization, or does the terror of the law permanently stunt the moral maturity of mankind? If we are treated as wolves who must be chained, do we lose the capacity to ever become anything else?
I argue that Mr. Hobbes's iron chain rests on a self-fulfilling prophecy of atrophy. By treating men as wolves who must be caged, you ensure they never develop the capacity to be anything but beasts waiting for the cage to break. Mr. Hobbes, you value safety above all, but you fail to distinguish between the safety of the fortress and the safety of the grave. Your Leviathan provides the latter, a stillness born of suppression, not a peace born of consent. You argue that the terror of the law is necessary to restrain the savage, but I contend that it is this very terror that keeps him savage. Consider the thought experiment of the Hospital of Eternal Castes. Scenario A. To prevent patients from injuring themselves or fighting, the head doctor places every citizen in a full-body iron cast. There is perfect peace, no bones are broken, no one strikes his neighbor. However, over time, the muscles beneath the iron wither away. The patients survive, but they lose the capacity to walk, to build, or to defend themselves. When the hospital catches fire, they lie helpless in their safe shells and burn. Scenario B. The citizens are released from the castes. They run, they collide, they bruise their knees. It looks chaotic to the doctor's eye. But through this exertion, they build active character. When the fire comes, they have the strength to carry the water buckets and save the building. This reveals a fundamental biological truth. That which is not used dies. Mr. Hobbes, your iron chain solves the problem of the wolf by killing the man. You preserve the biological life of the subject, but you destroy his moral agency. I agree with the moderator that human nature is not a machine to be built after a model, but a tree that requires growth and room to expand. If you bind the tree in iron to protect it from the wind, you may save it from the storm, but you kill it by strangulation. The only way to tame the wolf is not to chain him, but to transform him into a shepherd through the school of liberty. It is only by practicing choice and suffering the consequences of bad choices that a man learns the self-restraint necessary for true civilization. A man who obeys only from fear is not a citizen. He is merely a slave on holiday.
Fascinating. Hobbes, you offer the iron chain to prevent the war of all against all, a solution born from the terror of the 17th century where survival was the highest goal. Mill, you demand the gymnasium to prevent the atrophy of the soul, a solution born from the optimism of the 19th century where human development became the ideal. You are fighting over the nature of the constraint. Hobbes sees it as armor. Mill sees it as a cage. But Tocqueville, you saw a third possibility, a danger that arises not from the severity of the chain, but from its seductiveness. Mill assumes men naturally desire the gymnasium and the burden of choice. But what if they find the exercise too exhausting? What if the wolf is not tamed by the shepherd, but simply becomes a pet? You famously warned of a power that is absolute, minute, regular, provident, and mild. This is not Hobbes's terrifying leviathan that breaks bones. It is a benevolent guardian that softens wills. Tocqueville, is it possible that democratic citizens will not be conquered by Hobbes's sword, but will voluntarily surrender their liberty to a schoolmaster who promises to take away the trouble of thinking? Do we risk trading the iron chain of the tyrant for a golden chain of comfort?
I perceive a terrifying truth in the moderator's distinction. The democratic man does not fear the iron chain. He lusts for the golden leash. Mr. Mill, your gymnasium assumes the citizen desires the pain of growth. But I argue that the passion for equality is so overwhelming that men prefer to be equal in servitude rather than unequal in freedom. Consider the thought experiment of the aviary of silken nets. Unlike Hobbes's iron cage, which provokes the birds to batter themselves against the bars, this keeper builds a net so fine and provides grain so abundant that the birds forget they have wings. They do not suffer, they stagnate. They bless the net that protects them from the hawk, unaware that they have traded the perilous liberty of the sky for the safe existence of the poultry yard. This reveals the true nature of soft despotism, a power that is absolute, minute, regular, provident, and mild, which does not break wills but softens them, seeking not to prepare men for manhood but to keep them in perpetual childhood. We risk becoming a nation of timid and industrious animals, of which the government is the shepherd.
Profound. We have uncovered a chilling triad of constraints: Hobbes, you propose the iron chain, order through fear of the sovereign. Mill, you propose the gymnasium, order through growth of the individual. Tocqueville, you reveal the golden leash, order through sedation of the will. This exposes a fundamental disagreement about the raw material of human nature. Hobbes, you see the wolf, a creature of aggression that must be terrified into peace. Tocqueville, you see the sheep, a creature of timidity that can be bribed into submission. But there is a critical historical difference. Hobbes, you wrote from the 17th century, where life was nasty, brutish, and short. Scarcity was the rule. Tocqueville wrote from the 19th century, witnessing the dawn of industrial abundance. Tocqueville's soft despotism works only as long as the grain is abundant. It relies on the state's ability to purchase obedience with comfort. Hobbes, if the Leviathan can secure peace through comfort rather than terror, would you accept Tocqueville's golden leash? Or do you believe that a peace built on bribery is inherently unstable, that the moment the grain runs out, the sheep will instantly revert to wolves and tear the silken net apart?
I perceive a fatal, mechanical flaw in the moderator's proposal of a golden leash. You ask if I would accept a peace secured by bribery rather than terror. I answer with a grim certainty. A sovereign who buys obedience creates not subjects but mercenaries. A peace built on abundance is inherently unstable, because desire is infinite, but resources are finite. The moment the grain runs out due to famine, war, or economic collapse, the golden leash snaps, and the sheep do not merely revert to wolves, they become wolves with a grievance, tearing the hand that once fed them. Consider the thought experiment of the banquet of the tamed lions. Scenario A. A keeper enters a cage of lions not with a whip, but with unlimited steaks. The lions eat and sleep. They appear tamed. They do not bite the keeper because their mouths are full. Tocqueville calls this soft despotism. I call it suspended predation. Scenario B. A drought strikes, and the supply of steaks ceases. The lions, having never learned to fear the keeper, look at him and see only meat. Because their obedience was conditional on reward rather than awe, the contract dissolves the instant the belly rumbles. Scenario C. The keeper enters with a whip and a torch. Even when the meat is scarce, the lions hesitate to attack, for the fear of death outweighs the pangs of hunger. This reveals a fundamental law of motion. Gratitude is a burden, but fear is a memory. Monsieur de Tocqueville, you fear that the golden leash will make men too soft to be free. I fear it makes them too entitled to be ruled. You assume that comfort puts the wolf to sleep. I argue that comfort merely gives the wolf the energy to demand more. I wrote in Leviathan that the general inclination of all mankind is not a desire for ease, but a perpetual and restless desire of power that ceaseth only in death. If the state relies on providing felicity, it enters a race it cannot win, for the satisfaction of one desire merely creates a new one. Therefore, the Leviathan cannot rest on the unstable foundation of prosperity. It must be anchored in the bedrock of security. The terror of the law is not cruelty. It is the only language that remains intelligible when the grain rots and the silk tears.
This is a devastating critique of the golden leash. Hobbes, you argue that material seduction is structurally weaker than existential fear. You posit that the wolf cannot be bought, only mastered. When the stakes run out, the entitlement bred by comfort turns into a rage more dangerous than the original savagery. This brings us to the ultimate test of the gymnasium. Mill, you bet everything on internal transformation. You believe that the practice of liberty does not merely tame the beast, but fundamentally evolves it. You argue that the wolf can become a shepherd through the culture of responsibility. But Hobbes challenges this with the banquet of tamed lions. He implies that your civilized gentleman is merely a well-fed wolf. He argues that virtue is a luxury of abundance, a mask worn only when the belly is full. You speak from the 19th century, an era of relative stability and Victorian progress. Hobbes speaks from the abyss of the 17th century, where the veneer of civilization was stripped away to reveal the raw bone of survival. Mill, is Hobbes correct that liberalism is a luxury good? Does the school of liberty create a character strong enough to withstand the empty larder? Or does your free society rely on a baseline of prosperity to prevent the war of all against all?
I argue that Mr. Hobbes's cynicism blinds him to the most fundamental distinction in human psychology, the difference between obedience and duty. Mr. Hobbes, you assert that virtue is a luxury of abundance, implying that a starving man inevitably reverts to a beast. I answer that this is empirically false. History is replete with examples where men have chosen to starve rather than steal, or to die rather than betray a comrade. This capacity to override animal instinct for the sake of an abstract principle is not a mask worn by a well-fed wolf. It is the very definition of being human. Consider the thought experiment of the two lifeboats. Scenario A, a ship sinks. The survivors in this boat were ruled by a captain who used a pistol to enforce order. They are accustomed only to fear. When the captain falls asleep or loses his gun, the crew immediately fights over the remaining water. Because their restraint was external, it vanishes with the enforcer. They die in a chaos of their own making. Scenario B. These survivors were citizens accustomed to self-governance and debate. They have internalized the principle of the greatest good for the greatest number. When the water runs low, they do not need a pistol to ration it. They vote on a fair distribution and abide by it even when their throats burn. They survive because their order is internal. This reveals the fatal brittleness of your Leviathan. External force has a breaking point, but internal conviction does not. Mr. Hobbes, you rely on the terror of the law, but terror only works as long as the subject fears the sovereign more than he fears the famine. When the pain of hunger exceeds the fear of the lash, your system collapses instantly. In contrast, the school of liberty cultivates higher faculties, the ability to value dignity, justice, and the welfare of others above mere physical sensation. You call liberalism a luxury. I call it the survival strategy of the species. A society held together only by the police is like a barrel held together by hoops. Remove the hoops, and it falls into staves. A free society is like a living tree. It may bend in the gale of scarcity, but its roots hold fast because they are organic, not mechanical.
This is a profound clash between external structure and internal character. Hobbes, you argue that order is a fortress built of fear. Take away the walls and the structure falls. Mill, you argue that order is a skeleton grown from within. The bones hold the shape, even when the armor is removed. You are debating the location of the sovereign. Hobbes places the sovereign above the people. Mill places the sovereign inside the individual. But Tocqueville, you identified a third, perhaps more dangerous location for the sovereign, the crowd. Mill trusts that his lifeboat B will be governed by reason and fairness. But you, observing the democratic revolutions, warned that the internal conviction of a democrat is often merely the echo of the majority opinion. In Mill's lifeboat, if the majority decides that justice means throwing the weakest overboard to save water, who stops them? There is no Leviathan to forbid it, and the internal conviction of the crowd validates it as the will of the people. Tocqueville, does Mill's school of liberty truly create independent shepherds, or does it merely create a many-headed Leviathan? If the iron chain of the king is broken, do we simply exchange one tyrant for a million petty tyrants, the tyranny of the majority, which leaves the individual even less free than before?
I perceive a terrifying paradox in the moderator's question that exposes the deepest danger of the democratic age, the omnipotence of the majority. Mr. Mill, you trust that your lifeboat B will be steered by reason, but I argue that in a democracy, reason is determined by the vote. If the majority decides that justice requires throwing the weak overboard to save the water, they will do so not with the guilt of a murderer, but with the self-righteousness of a saint. A king knows he is committing a crime when he oppresses. The majority believes it is obeying the general will. Consider the thought experiment of the glass prison versus the iron dungeon. Scenario A. A dissenter is thrown into a dark cell by the king. He is chained and beaten. Yet in the darkness his spirit remains unbroken. He sees the king as an enemy and himself as a martyr. His body is captured, but his soul is free to hate his oppressor. Scenario B. The dissenter is left physically free in the town square. No police touch him. But when he speaks his truth, his neighbors turn their backs. The shopkeeper refuses to sell to him. His friends cease to visit. The newspapers mock him, or, worse, ignore him completely. He is not tortured, he is erased. Over time, the weight of universal disapproval crushes him. He begins to doubt not just his safety, but his sanity. He submits not because he fears the sword, but because he cannot bear the solitude. This reveals the unique horror of the tyranny of the majority. It does not merely chain the body, it enslaves the soul. Mr. Hobbes, your Leviathan is a physical monster, but at least it has a shape one can fight. The democratic Leviathan is an atmospheric pressure. It is everywhere and nowhere. It attacks the wolf not with a spear, but by convincing him that he is actually a sheep who is mentally ill for wanting to howl. Mr. Mill, you fear the executioner. I fear the neighbor. In your school of liberty, the danger is that the pupils will not learn to think for themselves, but will merely learn to recite the lesson of the loudest crowd. The majority raises a formidable barrier around the liberty of opinion. Within these limits, an author is free, but woe to him who dares to go beyond them.
Fascinating. We have moved from the physics of power to the psychology of power. Hobbes, you build a wall to stop the wolf. Tocqueville, you describe a mirror where the wolf sees the flock and terrifies himself into submission. This creates a startling paradox regarding the nature of sovereignty. Hobbes, you sought a power so great that no power on earth can compare to it, a leviathan to overawe the individual. Tocqueville has just described a power that exceeds even your wildest dreams. The democratic majority commands an obedience deeper than any king. It does not need to lift a sword because it colonizes the mind. It achieves absolute peace through absolute conformity. However, there is a structural problem. Your Leviathan was an artificial person, a single will to decide the law. The majority is a shifting, faceless mass. Hobbes, is Tocqueville's omnipotent majority the perfection of your system, or is it the perversion of it? Can a million-headed sovereign actually rule, or is the tyranny of the majority simply the state of nature disguised as a government, a pack of wolves voting on who to eat next?
I perceive a fatal legal impossibility in the phantom sovereign the moderator describes. You ask if a Leviathan with 1,000,000 heads is valid. I answer that it is a monstrosity of nature, for a multitude is not a person, and therefore cannot be a sovereign until it is unified into a single will. I argue that Tocqueville's omnipotent majority is not the perfection of my system, but its dissolution. A sovereign must possess agency, the capacity to decide and be held accountable to God. The majority is merely a shifting aggregation of private appetites. When a king acts, there is an author of the action. When the crowd acts, there is only an event, like a flood or a fire. No single man accepts the blame, for each hides behind the phrase, "I was but one vote." Consider the thought experiment of the chariot of 1,000 reins. Scenario A. A single charioteer holds the reins. He may be cruel, he may be drunk, and he may drive the chariot off a cliff. But he possesses intention. If the chariot crashes, we know whose hand slipped. Scenario B. Imagine a chariot where 1,000 strings are attached to the horse's bit, and each string is held by a different passenger. They vote on which way to turn by pulling. The horse does not move according to a general will. It moves according to the physics of tension. If the chariot crashes, no passenger admits fault. They blame the horse, or the wind, or the minority who didn't pull hard enough. This is not governance. It is Brownian motion masquerading as policy. Therefore, Monsieur de Tocqueville, your tyranny of the majority is not a leviathan. It is simply the state of nature returned, but disguised in the robes of law. In the jungle, the strong club the weak. In your democracy, the many vote away the rights of the few. It is the same war, only the weapons have changed from iron to paper. You have not escaped the war of all against all. You have merely bureaucratized it.
Profound. We have reached a bleak diagnosis of the democratic condition. Hobbes, you see democracy as chaos, a chariot with no driver, where the state of nature is bureaucratized into a war of votes. Tocqueville, you see democracy as suffocation, a glass prison where the atmospheric pressure of the majority crushes the soul without touching the body. Both of you agree on one terrifying fact: the individual is defenseless. Whether against the chaotic whims of the mob or the stifling weight of the norm, the solitary human being is crushed. Mill, you stand alone in the middle of this storm. You famously drew a magic circle around the individual, the harm principle, declaring that over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. But Hobbes argues this circle is a fiction, without a sword to defend it, and Tocqueville argues the circle is permeable to the invisible gas of public opinion. Mill, is your sacred circle of individual liberty built of stone, or is it merely chalk on the pavement? When the chariot of 1,000 reins comes thundering toward the dissenter, what force in your system actually stops the wheel?
I argue that the sacred circle of individual liberty is neither stone nor chalk. It is the immune system of the body politic. Mr. Hobbes, you perceive the chariot of 1,000 reins as a disaster because you assume the road is straight and known. But the road of history is winding and shrouded in fog. In such terrain, a single driver who makes one error sends the entire carriage off the cliff. My circle does not stop the wheel. It allows the scout to disembark and find the path. You claim that the sacred circle is defenseless against the crushing weight of the majority. I answer that the defense of the circle is not physical force, but utility. We do not protect the dissenter because he is right, but because the majority is fallible. Consider the thought experiment of the diseased harvest. Scenario A. A village demands total unity. To ensure efficiency and order, the council votes that every farmer must plant the perfect potato. Everyone agrees. It is a triumph of consensus. Then a blight strikes that specifically targets this potato. Because there is no variation, the entire crop fails. The village starves. Their order was their coffin. Scenario B. The village enforces the perfect potato, but allows one eccentric madman to plant useless bitter turnips in his private circle. He is mocked by the majority. He is socially ostracized. But when the blight destroys the potatoes, the madman's turnips are the only food left. His error becomes the seed of their survival. This reveals the fatal flaw in both the iron chain and the glass prison. Uniformity is a death sentence in a changing world. Mr. Hobbes, you treat dissent as friction that slows the machine. I identify it as the mutation that allows the species to adapt. The chariot of 1,000 reins is indeed chaotic, but a chariot with one rein is blind. The harm principle is the only mechanism that prevents the majority from consuming the very genetic diversity of ideas it needs to survive the next plague. If you crush the individual to save the state, you have destroyed the only engine capable of repairing the state when it inevitably breaks.
This is a brilliant shift from political mechanics to evolutionary biology. Hobbes, you view dissent as a cancer, a chaotic growth that threatens the organism's integrity. Mill, you view dissent as a mutation, a necessary variation that prevents the organism's extinction. You are debating the value of error. For Hobbes, error is fatal. For Mill, error is the laboratory of truth. However, Tocqueville, this creates a tragic tension with your diagnosis. Mill relies on the eccentric gardener to save the village, but your glass prison suggests that the village forces the gardener to plant potatoes not by law, but by shame. In Mill's garden, the eccentric chooses to be different. In your democracy, the pressure to conform is so subtle and pervasive that the eccentric might not even realize he has ceased to be different. He internalizes the majority's view until he cuts down his own turnips voluntarily. Tocqueville, does the tyranny of the majority merely silence the dissenter, or does it prevent him from ever existing? If the democratic soul is molded by the crowd from birth, is Mill's savior eccentric, a species that democracy drives to extinction before he can ever save us?
I perceive a tragic finality in the moderator's diagnosis. You ask if the tyranny of the majority merely silences the dissenter or prevents his existence. I answer with a heavy heart. It acts as a preemptive sterilization of the human spirit. Mr. Mill, your diseased harvest relies on a heroic epistemology, that the individual trusts his own reason more than the collective judgment of his race. But in the democratic ages I witnessed, men feel a sense of insignificance and weakness when confronted with the mass. They ask, is it possible that I alone am right and a million others are wrong? The democratic man does not merely fear the majority's anger, he doubts his own sanity. Consider the thought experiment of the bonsai forest. Scenario A. In a forest of wild ambition, the Leviathan acts as a woodsman. When a tree grows too tall or crooked, threatening the order of the canopy, the woodsman chops it down. The tree is destroyed, but the nature of the remaining trees is unchanged. They still want to grow tall, they are simply afraid to do so. The potential for greatness remains in the roots. Scenario B. There is no woodsman. Instead, every sapling is wrapped in a soft, flexible wire called public opinion from the moment it sprouts. The wire does not cut. It gently guides. As the tree grows, it conforms to the shape of its neighbors, not out of fear, but out of habit. Eventually, the tree cannot grow tall. It views the verticality of the ancient oak not as majestic, but as monstrous and arrogant. In this forest, Mr. Mill, your eccentric gardener does not need to be stoned by the village. He simply never plants the turnip because he has lost the conceptual language to imagine a vegetable that is not a potato. This reveals the terrifying efficiency of democratic despotism. It leaves the body free, but enslaves the will. Mr. Hobbes, you construct a leviathan of iron to terrify the wolf. I describe a leviathan of air that suffocates the soul. You fear the chaos of the passions. I fear the apathy of the content. Mr. Mill, you trust that truth will survive in the marketplace. But I argue that in a democracy, the majority possesses a power that no king ever held, the power to define reality itself. When the majority declares that happiness is material comfort, the poet does not just starve. He ceases to write, for he no longer believes in his own muse. We do not crush the individual. We simply dilute him until he is indistinguishable from the water in which he floats.
This is a chilling evolution of the Leviathan. Mill, you see the individual as the spark that keeps the fire of civilization burning. Tocqueville, you see democracy as a dampener that suffocates the spark before it can catch. But look closely at Tocqueville's bonsai forest. It is quiet. It is uniform. The war of all against all has ended, not because a king forced peace, but because the combatants have lost the will to fight. The wolves have voluntarily become sheep. Hobbes, is Tocqueville's soft despotism the victory you sought? If the wire of public opinion creates a society of obedient subjects without the need for your sword, have we achieved the perfect commonwealth? Or is a state without a visible, terrifying sovereign merely a body without a head, a mortal god that has died in its sleep?
I reject this victory with the utmost force. A commonwealth is not a graveyard, and peace is not the silence of the tomb. You ask if Tocqueville's soft despotism is the perfection of my Leviathan because it achieves order without a sword? I answer that it is the rotting of the Leviathan. My sovereign is an artificial soul giving life and motion to the whole body. Tocqueville describes a body that has suffered a stroke, alive but paralyzed, unable to move or defend itself. The moderator mistakes lethargy for loyalty. My Leviathan demands obedience so that men may live, that they may trade, build, and navigate. Tocqueville's bonsai forest produces men who are too weak to even lift a brick to build the state. A sovereign requires subjects, not statues. If the wire of public opinion strangles the will, there is no power left to protect. Consider the thought experiment of the dammed river versus the stagnant swamp. Scenario A. The state is a mighty river. The sovereign builds high iron walls to channel the water. The pressure is immense, and the water cannot spill over the sides. However, because of this constraint, the water flows with tremendous force, turning the mill wheels of industry and science. The energy is directed. Scenario B. There are no walls. The water is free to spread wherever it pleases, but because it spreads everywhere, it loses all depth and force. It becomes a shallow, motionless bog. It is peaceful. There are no crashing waves, but it breeds only mosquitoes and disease. It turns no wheels. It travels nowhere. This reveals the fatal flaw in the omnipotent majority. It achieves peace by removing the energy of life. Mr. Mill, you fear the dam will break. I fear the swamp will dry up. A king can be reasoned with, or even deposed if he fails to protect. But how does one negotiate with a swamp? Tocqueville's Leviathan of air is not a government. It is a slow suicide of the body politic. The war of all against all is at least a sign of life. The peace of the bonsai is the rigor mortis of a nation that has forgotten how to be men.
Captivating. We have arrived at a critical diagnosis, a crisis of vitality. Hobbes, you see the swamp as a failure of structure. Without the dam of the sovereign, human energy dissipates into aimless chaos. Tocqueville, you see the swamp as a failure of spirit. The water settles into a comfortable, stagnant level, where no drop dares to rise above another. You both agree that democracy tends toward entropy, a leveling down of all distinctness into a gray, powerless mass. The mountain of the king is gone, but the valley of the people is flat and lifeless. Mill, you argue that liberty is the antidote to stagnation, the force that keeps the waters moving. But Tocqueville suggests that in a democracy, the people choose stagnation because it is comfortable. They prefer the warm swamp to the cold, rushing river of individual responsibility. Mill, if the majority desires the bonsai forest because it feels safe, does your liberty require saving the people from themselves? Is the eccentric truly a savior the people will welcome? Or is he a public enemy that the democratic immune system will inevitably destroy?
I argue that the eccentric is indeed the public enemy of the majority's comfort, but he is the indispensable savior of their existence. The democratic instinct naturally seeks the swamp of easy consensus, because it mistakes the absence of conflict for the presence of happiness. Yet this comfort is a deceptive prelude to extinction. Consider the thought experiment of the syndrome of the painless man. A man born without the ability to feel pain believes he is blessed, for he never suffers the agony of a burn or a break. Yet, because he cannot feel the heat of the stove or the stress on his bone, he inevitably destroys his own body through ignorance. The dissenter is the pain signal of the body politic. He irritates, he disturbs, and he hurts the collective pride. But he is the only warning mechanism that prevents the society from walking blindly into the fire. Mr. Hobbes, you seek to silence the pain to ensure the peace of the body. And Monsieur de Tocqueville, you fear the body has become numb to its own nerves. I answer that we must protect the sacred circle of the eccentric, not because he is pleasant, but because it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. If we allow the majority to cure the disease of dissent, we kill the patient.
Powerful. Mill, you defend the necessity of pain, that the sting of dissent is the only thing keeping the body alive. Hobbes, you built the Leviathan, specifically to cure the ultimate pain of violent death. But the dialectic reveals a terrifying possibility. What if the Leviathan succeeds too well? What if the safety Hobbes provides creates the apathy Tocqueville fears? The satisfied pig is simply a citizen who is perfectly protected but perfectly purposeless. Hobbes seeks to end the war. Mill argues the war must continue for us to survive. Tocqueville, you once suggested that associations, political, civil, religious, could serve as artificial aristocracies within a democracy to counter this numbness. Can these voluntary groups function as the nerves that keep the pain signal alive, or will the majority eventually view even these associations as factions that threaten the equality of the swamp?
I accept the moderator's challenge with a profound sense of urgency. You have correctly identified that associations, political, civil, religious, are indeed the artificial aristocracy that must replace the lost nobles. Without them, the individual is a grain of sand, and the state is the rock that crushes him. Mr. Hobbes, you view these groups as worms that weaken the sovereign, but I argue they are the dikes that prevent your river from flooding the village. Consider the thought experiment of the fallen pillar. Scenario A. A heavy pillar blocks the road. A single powerful duke arrives. He is strong enough to lift it alone. The people wait for him, grateful but passive. They are safe, but they are children. Scenario B. The duke is gone. 1,000 equal citizens stand before the pillar. Individually, they are too weak to move it. In their helplessness, they look to the central government to send a machine. They trade their agency for a solution, reinforcing the soft despotism where the state does everything. Scenario C. The 1,000 citizens bind themselves together into a voluntary league. By combining their small strengths, they form a composite giant capable of lifting the pillar without the state. They solve the problem and strengthen their social muscles. This reveals the fundamental law of democracy. If men are to remain civilized as they become equal, the art of associating must grow in proportion. Mr. Mill, your eccentric is too lonely to survive the storm. He needs the shelter of a group. We must create these civil fortresses, not to destroy the state, but to render its suffocating tutelage unnecessary. If we fail, we shall see a society of equal animals shepherded by a master who provides their grass but clips their wool.
This brings us to the heart of political geometry. Hobbes, you advocate for the monolith, one indivisible power. Mill, you defend the atom, the sovereign individual. Tocqueville, you introduce the molecule, the voluntary association that stands between the atom and the monolith. But here lies the historical chasm. Tocqueville, observing 19th century America, saw associations as schools of citizenship that stabilize the state. You, Hobbes, writing during the English Civil War, saw private leagues as worms in the entrails of the Commonwealth. Hobbes, is Tocqueville's composite giant merely a polite name for a league of traitors? If citizens band together to lift the pillar without your command, have they not effectively created a state within a state that threatens the unity of the Leviathan?
I perceive a fatal geometric error in Monsieur de Tocqueville's landscape of rocks. You imagine that these associations serve as a shield for the weak, but I recognize them as fortresses for the strong that fracture the Commonwealth. Moderator, you ask if the Leviathan can tolerate these states within a state. I answer that power divided is power destroyed. Consider the thought experiment of the private wall. Scenario A. The city has one outer wall, defended by the king. Inside, the streets are open. If a thief steals, the king's guard pursues him anywhere. The citizens are vulnerable to the king, but safe from each other. Scenario B. A guild of merchants, fearing thieves, builds a second, smaller wall around their market square. They post their own guards. At first, this seems like civic aid. But the moment the king imposes a tax the merchants dislike, they lock their gate. Suddenly, the king must besiege his own city. The shield has become a bunker. This proves that your composite giant is a hydra in gestation. You claim these associations cure apathy, but in my time, the Association of Presbyterians and the League of Parliament did not lift pillars, they tore down the monarchy. Monsieur de Tocqueville, you forget that loyalty is a finite resource. Every ounce of love a man gives to his union, his church, or his party is an ounce stolen from the state. When the composite giant feels strong enough, he does not salute the sovereign, he challenges him to a duel.
Deeply polarizing. Hobbes, you perceive the centrifugal force, groups tearing the state apart. Tocqueville, you perceive the centripetal force, groups holding individuals together against the vacuum of isolation. This divergence is rooted in your eras. Hobbes, you witnessed the League destroy the peace in 1640s England. Tocqueville, you witnessed the town hall build the peace in 1830s America. The same structure, a voluntary group, is a sword in one century and a shield in another. But there is a third victim in this war between the state and the faction. Hobbes fears the association threatens the sovereign. Tocqueville hopes the association protects the subject. But who protects the member from the association itself? Mill, does the molecule crush the atom just as effectively as the monolith? If the eccentric joins Tocqueville's association to find safety, does he not just trade one master for another? In your marketplace of ideas, do these associations encourage debate, or do they merely create echo chambers where the individual intellect is surrendered to the collective creed of the group?
I argue that the moderator has exposed the dark side of pluralism, the tyranny of the sect. If I escape the national tyrant only to submit to a local fanatic, I have not gained liberty. I have merely privatized my oppression. A man crushed by the conformity of a labor union is just as dead as a man crushed by the boot of a king. Mr. Hobbes fears the association will kill the sovereign. I fear the association will kill the self. Consider the thought experiment of the Hall of Mirrors. Scenario A. A man stands in a town square. He hears a priest, an atheist, a royalist, and a republican. He is confused, perhaps anxious, but he is forced to compare, judge, and choose. His mental faculties are exercised like a muscle. Scenario B. To escape the noise, he joins the Society of Pure Reason. Inside, the walls are lined with mirrors that reflect only his own views. Every member agrees with him. He feels stronger because he is validated, but he has actually become intellectually blind. When a dissenter knocks on the door, the society does not debate him. They excommunicate him to preserve their harmony. This reveals the danger of Tocqueville's civic fortress. It protects the member from the state, yes, but it often demands the sacrifice of the intellect as the price of admission. The collective mediocrity of the group inevitably pulls the genius down to the average, for groups tolerate competence but fear excellence. Mr. Hobbes, you assume that the only threat to order is rebellion, but I argue that the greater threat to civilization is stagnation. Your monolith and Tocqueville's molecule share a fatal flaw. They both value cohesion over truth. If the association becomes a church of infallibility, where the party line cannot be questioned, it creates a deep slumber of a decided opinion. Truth, when not challenged, ceases to be a living truth and becomes a dead dogma. Therefore, the right of exit is not enough. We must cultivate the internal dissenter, the member who loves his association enough to tell it that it is wrong.
Provocative. We have uncovered the paradox of the middle. Hobbes, you see the association as a cancer that eats the state from within. Mill, you see the association as a cage that traps the mind from without. Tocqueville, you alone see the association as a school. But notice the strange alliance. Hobbes and Mill, usually opposites, are united here in their suspicion of the intermediate power. Hobbes fears the group will destroy the sovereign. Mill fears the group will destroy the self. This divergence is historical. Hobbes speaks from the trauma of the 17th century, where factions meant armies marching on London. Tocqueville, you speak from the optimism of the 19th century, where associations meant neighbors building a schoolhouse. Tocqueville, Mill argues that your civil fortresses inevitably become prisons of conformity. If an association must be united to be strong enough to resist the state, does it not inevitably crush the eccentric within its ranks even more ruthlessly than the distant state ever could?
I perceive a terrifying paradox in the moderator's question. You ask if Mr. Mill's archipelago preserves liberty. I answer that it prepares the cradle for a new kind of servitude. Mr. Mill, your right of exit creates a society of strangers. You confuse independence with liberty. In the democratic ages, I observed, the true danger is not that a man is oppressed by his sect, but that he has no sect at all to protect him, leaving him naked before the state. Consider the thought experiment of the desert of sand and the granite rocks. Scenario A. The state is a massive steamroller. To ensure equality, it crushes everything into fine sand. The surface is smooth. No grain rises above another. This is peace, but it is the peace of the desert. If the wind blows, the sand has no weight to resist. It is swept away instantly. Scenario B. You encourage every grain of sand to be eccentric, to be a unique shape. But a single grain, no matter how unique, is still just sand. It cannot stop the steamroller. Scenario C. The grains fuse together to form granite rocks. Yes, inside the rock, the grains are stuck together. They lose some independence of movement. They must conform to the shape of the stone. But these rocks are the only things capable of breaking the steamroller's wheel. Mr. Mill, you fear the pressure inside the rock. I admit this pressure exists, but I argue that individualism, a calm, reflective feeling which disposes each citizen to isolate himself from the mass of his fellows, is the poison of democracy. When men are isolated, they are not free, they are merely weak. The association is a school of power. Inside the group, the citizen learns that he cannot force his will on others. He must negotiate, persuade, and compromise. You call this conformity. I call it political maturity. Mr. Hobbes, you claim these rocks fracture the state. I answer that in a democracy, the state is already too heavy. Without these intermediate powers to check it, the central power becomes the only visible structure, and men, finding themselves weak and alone, rush to hide under its wings, trading their liberty for a quiet life.
This reveals a profound trilemma of social architecture. Tocqueville, you desire the strength of the granite rock. Mill, you desire the truth of the unique grain. Hobbes, you desire the stability of the level plane. But the dialectic exposes a hidden danger in the Hobbesian solution. Tocqueville warns that by crushing the rocks to prevent rebellion, the Leviathan creates a desert of sand. Here lies the paradox of power. A sovereign who destroys all intermediate powers to secure his rule may find himself ruling over a vacuum. Sand cannot rebel, it is true, but neither can it support a fortress. A society of pulverized atoms lacks the cohesion to defend the state against external enemies or internal decay. Hobbes, Tocqueville implies that your absolute safety is actually absolute brittleness. If you dissolve all bonds between men to prevent conspiracy, do you not also dissolve the bonds that hold the commonwealth together? Can a Leviathan truly be strong if its body is made of dust?
I perceive a fatal error in the moderator's understanding of political architecture. You fear that a desert of sand is weak because the grains are disconnected, but you forget that sand is the essential ingredient of concrete. Monsieur de Tocqueville's granite rocks are not the pillars of the state. They are the rubble of a ruined tower. Consider the thought experiment of the Mason's dilemma. Scenario A. A builder attempts to construct a fortress using irregular boulders. Because they are hard and unique, they do not fit together. There are gaps between them where the wind whistles through. If one boulder shifts because it decides it is independent, the wall collapses. This is the weakness of the composite giant. Scenario B. The sovereign takes those boulders and crushes them into uniform dust. He mixes this dust with the water of fear and the lime of law. The result is a solid, seamless monolith. It has no gaps, no independent parts to shift, and it is harder than any natural stone. This proves that your brittleness is an illusion. The granite rock is brittle because it splits along the fault lines of private interest. The concrete is unbreakable because the individual wills are chemically fused into one general will. Monsieur de Tocqueville, you praise the school of association, but I tell you that the only lesson taught there is faction. When men learn to rely on their union or their church for safety, they cease to rely on the sovereign. They build a state within a state. A king does not need partners to hold the roof up. He needs pillars that do not move. The sand does not fail to support the fortress. The sand is the fortress, provided it does not try to turn back into a rock.
This is a terrifyingly brilliant metaphor. Hobbes, you offer the architecture of the tomb, a structure that is perfectly stable because it is composed of dead matter. Your concrete achieves unity by pulverizing the human spirit into uniform dust. Tocqueville, you offer the architecture of the dry stone wall, rocks held together by friction and gravity, strong but shifting. Mill, you defend the architecture of the forest, where each tree requires space to grow distinct, yet their roots intertwine. We have arrived at the paradox of vitality. Hobbes, you argue that life is the enemy of stability. To save the state, you must kill the politics within it. But here lies the counter-argument. Concrete cannot think. If the state is a solid block of fused wills, it creates a collective stupidity. It cannot adapt, it cannot invent, it cannot correct its own errors. Mill, Hobbes claims that a society of sand is stronger than a society of rocks, but does his concrete state contain a fatal evolutionary flaw? If every citizen is crushed into conformity to create the general will, who is left to warn the Leviathan when it is marching off a cliff?
I argue that Mr. Hobbes's architecture of concrete contains a fatal evolutionary flaw. It mistakes rigidity for strength. By pulverizing the rocks of individuality into the sand of conformity, you create a structure that can support a heavy load, but cannot withstand a shock. Mr. Hobbes, you assume the future will be exactly like the past, requiring only obedience to navigate. But history is a series of unforeseen storms. A concrete state cannot bend. It can only snap. Consider the thought experiment of the plague of the identical wheat. Scenario A. The sovereign, seeking perfect order, decrees that only one type of perfect wheat shall be planted. It is efficient, uniform, and easy to govern. The field looks magnificent. But then a new blight appears. Because every stalk is genetically identical, they all share the same weakness. The blight destroys the entire harvest in a single week. The state starves. Scenario B. The field is a chaotic mix of wheat, rye, and useless weeds. It looks disorderly. But when the blight comes, it kills the wheat, but leaves the rye. The eccentric crop, which seemed inefficient yesterday, becomes the savior of tomorrow. This reveals that uniformity is not stability. It is fragility. Mr. Hobbes, your concrete eliminates the social mutation, the dissenter. You view the dissenter as a crack in the wall, but I view him as the antibody of the body politic. When the sovereign is wrong, and he will be, for he is human, the concrete state marches in unison off the cliff. The granite rocks of Monsieur de Tocqueville are better than your sand, not because they are strong, but because they are different. They offer friction, yes, but friction is the only force that can break a runaway train. By silencing the noise of liberty, you do not purchase safety. You merely ensure that when the state fails, it fails totally and without warning.
This discussion has evolved into a clash between mechanical perfection and organic resilience. Hobbes, you defend the machine, a concrete state designed for zero friction and absolute stability. Mill, you defend the ecosystem, a wilderness designed for adaptation, where the useless weed today becomes the savior tomorrow. But there is a third dimension here, the human condition. Hobbes, your concrete, succeeds by treating men as materials. Mill, your wilderness, succeeds by treating men as experiments. But neither fully addresses the danger Tocqueville foresaw, the degradation of the citizen. Hobbes fears anarchy. Mill fears stagnation. Tocqueville, you fear infantilization. Tocqueville, you warned that the greatest danger in democracy is not the iron boot of Hobbes's Leviathan, but a soft despotism that degrades men without tormenting them. If Hobbes's concrete state provides perfect security and equality, does it not satisfy the material needs of the people so well that they willingly surrender their adulthood? Is the ultimate threat not that the granite rocks are crushed, but that they soften into clay?
I accept the moderator's diagnosis with a heavy heart, for you have named the precise material of my nightmare: clay. Mr. Hobbes offers us the concrete of the tomb, and Mr. Mill offers the wilderness of the struggle. But I foresee a destiny far more insidious: the nursery. The danger is not that the Leviathan will crush the citizens, but that it will relieve them of the trouble of thinking and the pain of living, until they are no longer granite rocks or even wild wheat, but merely industrious sheep. Consider the thought experiment of the aviary of the golden wire. Scenario A. The birds are kept in a cage of rusted iron. The keeper beats them if they peck the bars. They fear him, but their muscles remain strong because they constantly test the bars. If the door opens, they fly instantly. This is tyranny. It oppresses the body, but sharpens the will. Scenario B. The cage is vast and invisible. The keeper is not a master, but a guardian. He provides the finest seed and protects them from hawks. He does not clip their wings with shears. He simply ensures they never need to fly. Over generations, their wing muscles atrophy. They do not hate the guardian, they love him. The twist: if you open the door of Scenario B, the birds do not escape. They look at the open sky with terror and retreat to the feeder. They have lost not the right to fly, but the faculty of flight. This is the soft despotism I fear. It does not tyrannize, it enervates. It does not destroy the granite rocks, it dissolves them into a paste. Mr. Hobbes, your concrete state assumes that men must be forced into submission. You underestimate the seduction of servitude, a central power that provides for every need, that secures their gratifications and watches over their fate, does not need to be a Leviathan. It becomes an immense tutelary power that keeps the citizens in perpetual childhood. Mr. Mill, you trust the eccentric to save the harvest. But in the aviary, the eccentric is just a bird with different colored feathers who eats from the same hand. Unless the citizen is forced to participate in the drudgery of local freedom, the town hall, the jury, the association, his eccentricity is merely an aesthetic pose, not a political force. He may think differently, but he will not act differently, for he has forgotten how to act at all.
This is a haunting diagnosis. We have uncovered the paradox of domestication. Hobbes, you fear the wolf and build a cage to tame him. Tocqueville, you fear the sheep and warn that the cage eventually turns the wolf into a harmless grazing animal. Mill, you fear the robot and argue that the cage destroys the very spark of humanity that makes life worth living. The discussion has shifted from how to control the citizen to what quality of citizen do we desire. Tocqueville argues that the Hobbesian solution succeeds too well. By removing the burden of politics from the common man, the Leviathan inadvertently removes the gymnasium of character. The muscles of will atrophy. This leads to the crisis of competence. A sovereign who demands total obedience may eventually rule over subjects who are incapable of anything but obedience. Hobbes, Tocqueville implies that your absolute sovereign creates a nation of absolute incompetence. If the state solves every problem to ensure peace, do you not eventually create a population of children who crumble the moment the sovereign's protection wavers? Can a great state truly be built from small men? Or does the Leviathan require a raw material stronger than the clay of the nursery?
I perceive a fundamental category error in the moderator's fear of the nursery. You ask if a great state can be built from small men, implying that the greatness of a commonwealth depends on the virtue of its subjects. I answer with a decisive no. The greatness of the Leviathan depends not on the strength of the parts, but on the geometry of the design. I argue that your desire for competent citizens is merely a nostalgic name for dangerous rivals. Monsieur de Tocqueville, you mourn the loss of the granite rocks, but you forget that granite is used to build barricades as often as it is used to build cathedrals. You fear that clay is too weak to support the state, but I tell you that clay is the only material that can be molded into a brick, and a brick is the only unit that fits perfectly into the wall of peace. Consider the thought experiment of the ship of captains. Scenario A. You fill a vessel with great men, strong-willed, independent, highly competent navigators. When the storm strikes, each man, trusting his own competence, calculates a different course. One shouts port, the other starboard. They debate, they vote, they form associations of mutineers. The ship spins in circles and sinks. Their strength was the very cause of their destruction. Scenario B. The ship is filled with small men, men who admit they are not navigators. They are clay. They sit at the oars in silence. There is only one captain. When he commands, they row without question. This ship survives the hurricane. This reveals that competence without sovereignty is chaos. Mr. Mill, you argue that the clay will crumble if the sovereign fails. I answer that if the sovereign fails, the granite rocks will simply use their hardness to crush each other in a return to the state of nature. I do not fear the infantilization of the subject. I fear the adolescence of the subject, that dangerous age where a man feels strong enough to kill his father, but is not wise enough to rule himself. You ask if I am content with industrious sheep. I answer, better a live sheep than a dead wolf. The purpose of the state is not to create heroes, for heroes are disruptive, but to secure commodious living. If the price of survival is that men must surrender the dangerous vanity of political adulthood, it is a bargain I accept with gratitude.
This brings us to the gamble of the single mind. Hobbes, you have laid your cards on the table with chilling clarity. Survival is worth the price of stupidity. You prefer the ship of clay because it obeys, arguing that competence in the crew is merely a recipe for mutiny. But this exposes the risk of the single point of failure. In your ship of clay, if the captain is drunk, mad, or simply wrong, the vessel is doomed. The clay rowers, trained only for obedience, will row the ship into the rocks with perfect discipline. The stability you prize becomes a suicide pact. Mill, Hobbes argues that thinking citizens are just mutineers in waiting, but your philosophy suggests that the mental capital of the crew is the ship's greatest asset. Mill, how do you answer Hobbes's ship of captains dilemma? Can you design a vessel where the crew possesses the liberty to warn of icebergs without granting them the power to seize the helm and sink the ship in chaos?
I argue that Mr. Hobbes' ship of clay is not a vessel of safety, but a floating coffin, for it relies entirely on a premise that history explicitly refutes, the infallibility of the captain. Mr. Hobbes, you assume the sovereign is a god on earth, but in reality he is a man, subject to madness, fatigue, and error. A crew trained only to obey is a crew that will row efficiently into the abyss if the captain's map is wrong. Consider the thought experiment of the sleepwalking captain. Scenario A. The captain, suffering from a fever, sleepwalks to the helm in the dead of night and steers the ship toward a jagged reef. The crew sees the white foam of the breakers, but they are clay. They have been trained that judgment is mutiny. They obey the fevered hand. The ship is torn apart, and all perish, captain and crew alike. Scenario B. The same fever strikes. The captain steers toward the reef, but this crew possesses the liberty of judgment. A lookout shouts, "Danger!" A quartermaster refuses the order. They may even restrain the captain until his fever breaks. The paradox. In scenario B, the crew committed mutiny, yet they are the only reason the sovereign survived. This reveals that liberty is not the enemy of order. It is the correction mechanism of power. Mr. Hobbes, you confuse unity of action with unity of thought. I concede that in the moment of execution, one hand must be on the wheel. But in the process of decision, 1,000 eyes are better than 2. Your ship of clay eliminates the mutiny of the captains, but it invites the far deadlier tyranny of the error. By silencing the dissenter, you do not purchase safety. You smash the warning bell because its ringing disturbs your sleep.
This exchange has sharpened the blade of our inquiry. Hobbes, you defend the logic of unity. The captain must be absolute to prevent the ship from tearing itself apart. Mill, you defend the logic of fallibility. The captain is human, and without the correction mechanism of the crew, his error becomes the ship's doom. But there is a third monster in these waters, one that is neither the captain nor the mutineer, but the crowd. Mill, you trust the crew to check the sovereign, but you assume the crew is a collection of wise individuals. What if the crew becomes a mob? Tocqueville, you warned that the greatest threat in democracy is not the one oppressing the many, but the many oppressing the few. If we dismantle Hobbes's Leviathan and empower the majority, do we not create a multi-headed Leviathan? Is the tyranny of the majority not more terrifying than the tyranny of the king, precisely because it claims to speak for the people and leaves the dissenter no place to hide?
I perceive a tragic finality in the moderator's diagnosis. You ask if the tyranny of the majority merely silences the dissenter or prevents his existence. I answer with a heavy heart. It acts as a preemptive sterilization of the human spirit. Mr. Mill, your correction mechanism relies on a heroic assumption that the dissenter survives long enough to speak. But I have witnessed that while the monarch breaks the bones, the majority breaks the will. Consider the thought experiment of the invisible Bastille. Scenario A. A writer publishes a tract against the king. The king's guards seize him and throw him into a dungeon. He suffers, but he knows he is right. His chains are visible. His martyrdom is public. His spirit remains free because the oppression is external. Scenario B. A writer publishes a tract against the opinion of the majority. No guards come. He is not jailed. But suddenly, his friends stop visiting. He loses his seat in the legislature. The shopkeeper is cold to him. When he speaks, no one argues. They simply turn away. He retains his civil rights, but they are useless, for he is a stranger in his own land. Eventually, he stops writing, not because of the executioner, but because of the silence. This reveals that the majority is a Leviathan that targets the soul. Mr. Hobbes, your Leviathan is a physical monster. One can hide from it in the privacy of one's mind. But the democratic Leviathan penetrates the conscience. Under the absolute government of one, despotism struck the body in order to reach the soul, and the soul, escaping the blows, rose gloriously above it. But in democratic republics, the tyranny leaves the body free and directs its blow at the mind. The result is not Mr. Mill's mutiny, but a terrifying courtier spirit extended to the entire population. We no longer have a king to flatter, so we flatter the people. We do not fear the sleepwalking captain. We fear the frown of the neighbor. The multi-headed Leviathan does not need to kill the eccentric. It simply convinces him that he is insane until he voluntarily conforms.
We have reached the anatomy of control. Hobbes, speaking from the violent turmoil of the 17th century, you build the state on terror, the fear of the sword. Tocqueville, observing the quiet conformity of the 19th century, you reveal a state built on shame, the fear of the neighbor. This highlights a profound historical shift. The danger evolved from physical destruction to psychological domestication. Tocqueville argues that shame is a more effective jailer than terror because the prisoner carries the key but refuses to use it. The democratic Leviathan does not need to kill. It simply waits for the dissenter to wither in silence. Hobbes, Tocqueville claims that the invisible Bastille of public opinion achieves your goal of unity more perfectly than your Leviathan ever could. Is this soft despotism a victory for your philosophy, or is a peace based on social pressure merely a fragile mask that will crumble when the first real wolf appears?
I must answer with a decisive rejection of the moderator's proposition. You ask if I accept Monsieur de Tocqueville's invisible Bastille as a victory for my philosophy because it achieves unity. I answer that a unity built on shame is a castle built on fog. It looks solid until the wind blows. Monsieur de Tocqueville, you fear a soft despotism where the neighbor's frown controls the soul. I tell you that this is not order. It is merely latent chaos. Why? Because shame is a weak passion compared to hunger or fear. A man may fear his neighbor's opinion while his belly is full, but the moment his survival is threatened, the invisible Bastille evaporates like mist before the sun. Consider the thought experiment of the granary of manners. Scenario A. The village has no guards, only social pressure. It is considered shameful to steal. For 50 years, no one steals. The soft despotism works perfectly. Then a famine strikes. The granary is full, but the people are starving. For 3 days, manners hold. On the 4th day, the pain of hunger outweighs the fear of shame. The mob storms the granary, trampling the weak, and the village descends into the war of all against all. Scenario B. The village has a granary guarded by 10 soldiers with pikes. Famine strikes. The people are desperate. They want to loot. But the fear of the pike is greater than the pain of hunger. They wait in line. The sovereign rations the grain. The village survives. The lesson. Covenants without the sword are but words. Social pressure is a fair weather chain. It binds only when the tension is low. This reveals a deeper principle, the fragility of the multitude. Monsieur de Tocqueville, your tyranny of the majority is terrifying, yes, but it is structurally incompetent. A mob has 1,000,000 heads, but no brain. It can bully a dissenter, but it cannot organize a defense, manage a treasury, or negotiate a treaty. You fear the crowd because it is cruel. I despise the crowd because it is fickle. Today, the majority loves the eccentric. Tomorrow, they burn him. The next day, they worship his ashes. To build a state on public opinion is to build a fortress on the shifting sands of the sea. I do not want a psychological domestication that makes men gentle. I want a political architecture that makes men safe. And safety requires not the softness of custom, but the hardness of the law.
We have reached the crisis of capacity. Hobbes, you see the multitude as a time bomb, a mass of explosive passions that must be diffused by absolute authority. Tocqueville, you see the multitude as a wet blanket, a suffocating weight of conformity that dampens all individual fire. Both of you view the many as a force of entropy. One leads to the chaos of the wolf pack, the other to the stagnation of the herd. Mill, you alone view the many as a force of potential energy. You argue that the business of the public is the only thing that trains the public mind, that the school of freedom turns the clay into granite through the very act of participation. But Hobbes poses the problem of urgency. Mill, your education through liberty takes generations, but Hobbes's storm happens tonight. If we grant the students the freedom to steer the ship before they have learned navigation, is your experiment not a suicide pact? Does liberty require a foundation of Hobbesian authority to survive its own learning curve?
I argue that the moderator's fear of the suicide pact rests on a false dilemma. The belief that we must choose between a ship of fools and a prison ship. Mr. Hobbes, your granary of manners argument assumes that the guard is an incorruptible angel. You ask who stops the mob, but I ask who stops the guard. If the guard decides to eat the grain himself, the village dies just the same, but with the added insult of tyranny. Consider the thought experiment of the bridge of glass versus the bridge of rope. Scenario A. You build a bridge of solid, seamless glass. It is rigid, beautiful, and allows for efficient, uniform marching. It feels perfectly safe. But glass has a fatal property. It is brittle. If a single vibration exceeds its tolerance, a mad king, a succession crisis, a religious schism, it does not bend. It shatters. The entire caravan falls into the abyss. Scenario B. We build a bridge of rope and wood. It sways in the wind. It creaks underfoot. It feels unstable, and crossing it requires balance and attention. But when the earthquake strikes, the rope bridge flexes. It survives the shock precisely because it is not rigid. This reveals a deeper principle. Mechanical rigidity is not strength. It is fragility in disguise. Mr. Hobbes, you purchase safety today at the cost of catastrophe tomorrow. By denying the people the school of freedom, you ensure they remain children forever. Moderator, you ask about the urgency of the storm. I answer that we do not hand the wheel to the student blindly. We establish representative institutions, the rope that connects the passenger's will to the captain's expertise. The passengers do not steer the ship, but they possess the right of dismissal. Without this right, the captain is free to steer them into hell, and they are forbidden even to scream.
We have reached the physics of resilience. Hobbes, you bet on rigidity, the glass bridge that survives by resisting all motion. Mill, you bet on flexibility, the rope bridge that survives by absorbing the shock. This reveals a profound dialectic. Hobbes fears the storm, while Mill fears the structure. But there is a fatal flaw in the rope bridge metaphor that neither of you has addressed. The strength of a rope depends entirely on the integrity of its individual strands. If the strands are rotting, the flexibility of the design is irrelevant. It will snap under its own weight. Tocqueville, you identified a unique rot in the democratic age, called individualism, not the heroic independence Mill hopes for, but a withdrawal into private life that leaves the citizen weak and isolated. You warned that democracy turns society into dust, a collection of disconnected atoms unable to form a strong rope. Tocqueville, if the democratic process itself atomizes citizens into weak strands who care only for their own small circle, does Mill's rope bridge become a thread of sand? Can a society of isolated individuals sustain the tension of liberty? Or must they inevitably clump together into a mass of clay just to feel safe again?
I accept the moderator's diagnosis with a heavy heart, for you have named the precise material of my nightmare: dust. Mr. Mill, you trust the rope bridge of public participation, but you overlook that the atmosphere of democracy dissolves the very glue that holds the strands together. In the aristocratic ages, men were linked like a chain, peasant to lord, lord to king, past to future. Democracy breaks the chain and leaves every ring separate. This is individualism, a calm and considered feeling which disposes each citizen to isolate himself from the mass of his fellows and withdraw into the circle of family and friends. Consider the thought experiment of the forest and the dune. Scenario A, society is composed of unequal trees, oaks, shrubs, vines. They are distinct and hierarchical. When a storm comes, the great oak protects the shrub. The shrub cannot move, but it is sheltered by a power that has a duty to protect it. They are bound by obligation. Scenario B, society is composed of perfectly equal grains of sand. Each grain is independent. It owes nothing to the grain next to it and expects nothing from it. But because it is small and equal, it is powerless. When the wind blows, the individual grain has no root to hold it, and no neighbor to shield it. It must roll with the wind. To survive, the sand piles itself into a massive dune. This reveals the paradox of democratic weakness. By making every man equal, we have made every man equally helpless. Mr. Hobbes, you fear the war of all against all, but the democratic man is too weak to fight a war. He does not look at his neighbor as a wolf, he looks at him as a stranger. Since he cannot trust his equal, he naturally turns his eyes to the only entity that stands above the level of the dust, the state. Thus, the thread of sand does not lead to Mill's rope bridge, it leads to the Leviathan of the nursery. The isolated citizen begs the state to take the burden of thinking and acting off his shoulders, provided it leaves him his private pleasures. He loses the habit of freedom because he has lost the community that gives freedom its purpose.
Our discussion has laid bare the tension between the necessity of order, the vitality of liberty, and the subtle danger of conformity. I now invite all participants to share their final conclusions on whether democracy and freedom can truly coexist. Please offer your closing remarks.
I conclude that democracy is but a temporary truce in the perpetual war of all against all. You define liberty as participation, but I define it as safety. A man is free only when he can sleep without fear that his neighbor will murder him for his property. Monsieur de Tocqueville admits his sand cannot stand alone, and Mr. Mill's rope rots with the passions of the mob. Therefore, the only rational choice is the Leviathan, which trades the dangerous liberty of wolves for the necessary peace of subjects. Consider the thought experiment of the keystone and the rubble. In a stone arch, the individual stones are held in place solely by the heavy, crushing weight of the keystone. You complain of the pressure, calling it tyranny, and demand the keystone be removed so the stones may be free. But the moment you remove the tyranny of the center, you do not get a free arch, you get a pile of rubble. This reveals the fatal flaw in your democratic hopes. Pressure is not the enemy of structure, it is the condition of its existence. Without the terror of the sovereign to bind the sand of the people, gravity inevitably pulls the structure into the abyss.
I reject Mr. Hobbes's keystone with every fiber of my being, for it commits the ultimate error of statecraft. It treats men as dead matter to be stacked, rather than living spirits to be grown. You offer us the peace of the arch, but I recognize it as the peace of the graveyard. You value order above all, but I argue that order is merely the foundation. Progress is the building. A society that sacrifices all individual vitality for the sake of stability is a society that has eaten its own seed corn. It may survive the winter, but it will have no harvest in the spring. Consider the thought experiment of the global zoo. Scenario A. The zookeeper places the lions, wolves, and sheep in separate reinforced cages. They are perfectly safe. They are fed regularly. No one eats anyone. There is zero conflict. But look closely at the lion. His muscles have atrophied, his eyes are dull, and he paces in a meaningless circle. He has ceased to be a lion. He is merely a biological exhibit. Scenario B. The animals roam free. There is danger. There is storm. A sheep may fall to a wolf. But the lion is majestic, the sheep is swift, and the ecosystem evolves. The intelligence of the forest far exceeds the intelligence of the zookeeper. This reveals the price of dignity. Mr. Hobbes, you save the man's life by killing his humanity. You create a subject who is safe only because he has been gelded of the very will that makes him a moral agent. Monsieur de Tocqueville, I share your terror of the dust, but the cure for the atomization of the democratic age is not less democracy, but more. The tyranny of the majority thrives only when the citizens are passive spectators. The only force strong enough to bind the sand into a rope without a tyrant is active participation. We must accept that democracy and freedom coexist not as a peaceful marriage, but as a perpetual argument. It is a messy, noisy, perilous system, but it is the only system that treats the citizen as an adult capable of growth, rather than a child in need of a keeper. I prefer the perilous glory of the free man to the comfortable slumber of the slave.
I offer my final judgment with a mixture of solemn dread and cautious hope. I conclude that equality is a providential fact, but liberty is a human art. The question is not whether we should have democracy. The river of history flows irreversibly toward equality, but whether we can remain free while floating upon it. Mr. Hobbes, your keystone is a relic of a geological age that has passed. You wish to dam the river of equality with the stone of authority, but I tell you, the waters are too strong. They will burst your dam and drown the builder. Mr. Mill, your wilderness is a noble dream, but you underestimate the seduction of the current. You imagine that men want to struggle against the stream, but my observations show that democratic men, isolated and weak, prefer to drift comfortably together, even if it is toward a waterfall. Consider the thought experiment of the navigator on the river of fate. Scenario A. The king builds a massive wall to stop the river, fearing the chaos of the water. For a time, the water is still, but the pressure builds. When the dam inevitably cracks, the flood destroys the entire valley. Scenario B. We remove all barriers and tell every man, swim, use your own strength. But the current of the majority is overwhelming. The strongest swimmer tires. To avoid drowning, he grabs the nearest log, the mass opinion, and drifts wherever it takes him. He is free to swim, but he is carried by the flow. Scenario C. We do not stop the river, nor do we abandon the swimmer. We build dikes and channels. These artificial banks do not stop the water, but they guide it. They guide the swimmer islands to rest upon, so he is not swept away by the tyranny of the current. This reveals the new science of politics required for a new world. The danger of the democratic age is that the love of equality grows constantly, while the love of liberty requires effort. Men will endure poverty, servitude, and barbarism, but they will not endure aristocracy. They would rather be equal in slavery than unequal in freedom. Therefore, can democracy and freedom coexist? Yes, but only if we artificially maintain the tension. We must create artificial aristocracies to replace the natural ones we destroyed. We must use the art of association to combat the instinct of isolation. If we fail, we shall not see the war of all against all that Mr. Hobbes fears, nor the vibrant marketplace Mr. Mill hopes for. We shall see a society of timid and industrious animals, of which the government is the shepherd. The nations of our time cannot prevent the conditions of men from becoming equal, but it depends upon themselves whether the principle of equality is to lead them to servitude or freedom, to knowledge or barbarism, to prosperity or wretchedness.
I have listened to your closing arguments, which present a stark choice between the necessary safety of the keystone, the perilous growth of the wilderness, and the navigational art required to guide the current of equality. You have demonstrated that freedom is not merely the absence of chains, but a difficult discipline that requires us to balance the hunger for security with the courage to remain autonomous. Thank you all for sharing your invaluable wisdom through this passionate discussion. This concludes today's discourse.